Today we're venturing deep into the heart of Texas, where the land is as vast as its legends and just as terrifying. From eerie lights haunting dark rivers to ancient forces that never should have been disturbed, get ready for 20 of the most disturbing true Texas highway horror stories that will make you question what's real and what's lurking just beyond the horizon. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing, and by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now let's dive into the darkness. Highway 222 runs lonely and dark across a forgotten stretch of Texas, the kind of road you take when you want to shave a few minutes off your drive but end up wondering if the saving was worth it. I learned that lesson one August night in 2012, when the air was heavy with the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back and your eyelids drag like weights. I'd been on the road all day, moving furniture for my cousin from Abilene down toward Waco, and I had cut off onto 222 just after midnight, thinking I'd skip the longer, safer route. The map showed it as a clean shot, a thin white line through scrubland and cow pasture. But no map can tell you what a road feels like when you're the only headlights for 30 miles. It was black country out there, the mesquite trees leaning in like they were listening, the cicadas grinding out their endless mechanical screech, and the occasional coyote lifting its voice into a scream that carried forever across the plains. There was a rest stop about halfway down the stretch, a squat, concrete place with 2 vending machines under buzzing floodlights. I almost drove past it, but my eyes felt like sand and my knuckles were white on the wheel, so I figured 5 minutes wouldn't kill me. I pulled in, gravel popping under my tires, and rolled up next to the vending machines. They were humming, like they'd been there since the 70s. Sun-faded decals peeling off the front, one with soda, the other with candy bars and chips that looked like they'd long expired. The floodlights lit everything with a harsh white glare, too bright against the midnight black around it, and for a second the silence seemed even heavier. Then I noticed him. The man stood between the machines, tall as hell, broad shoulders filling out an old denim jacket. He wore a cowboy hat pulled low over his face, but what I could see of his jaw looked wrong somehow. Too sharp, too pale in the floodlight. He didn't move when I cut the engine. He didn't so much as flinch when the gravel popped under my boots. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides like a mannequin planted in the dirt. "Evenin'," I tried. Because in Texas you speak to folks even if they don't look like they want to be spoken to. No answer. I felt the heat crawling on my neck. Maybe he was deaf, I thought, or drunk, or out of his mind. But there was nothing in his stance that said drunk. He was too still. Not swaying, not shifting, not even breathing. So far as I could tell. Just locked there in place, and the longer I looked, the more I felt like he was waiting for me. I stepped toward the soda machine, fumbling in my pocket for a few quarters, trying to act normal. But the closer I got, the more wrong the air felt. It was stifling a moment before, the cicadas screaming like they owned the world, but now the noise had bled out. No bugs, no coyotes, not even the wind through the mesquite. Just the harsh electric buzz of the lights and the thud of my own heart. I fed the machine and bent to grab the can of Dr. Pepper, and I swear to God, in the reflection of the glass I saw his head turn toward me. Slow, deliberate. But when I jerked up, the brim of his hat hadn't moved an inch. He was still facing, straight ahead, locked like a statue. I should have left right then, but I told myself I was tired, my brain playing tricks. I popped the can and took a sip. Warm, metallic. I turned toward my truck, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl worse than anything yet. The vending machines were humming, the lights buzzing, my engine ticking as it cooled. But the man, he didn't cast a shadow. Both machines threw dark, hard-edged shadows against the wall behind them. But the tall figure between them? Nothing. just a pale smear of concrete lit up by the floodlights. I felt a wave of cold so sharp, it cut through the sticky heat. I climbed back into my truck, slammed the door, and locked it like that thin sheet of glass and steel was going to protect me. My hands were shaking so bad I nearly dropped the keys. I started the engine, headlights throwing the world back into sharp color, but the man didn't react. He just stood there in that slice of artificial daylight, cowboy hat low, denim jacket hanging heavy, hands still at his sides. I reversed hard enough to kick up gravel, then pulled onto the road, tires squealing. My rearview mirror caught him, as I went, still frozen in place. But just as the rest dropped away behind me, I thought I saw him take one step forward. I drove like hell the rest of the way, heart jackhammering in my chest, trying to shake off the image. By dawn, I was convincing myself it hadn't happened the way I remembered. Just exhaustion, shadows playing tricks, some local ranch hand standing out there for reasons I'd never know. I almost believed that, until 2 weeks later, when I was back in Abilene, drinking with a buddy at a bar. He drove a rig for a living, ran all over the state, and when I told him I'd taken 222, he cut me off. "You didn't stop at the machines, did you?" he asked, his face going flat. I told him I had. He looked at me like I'd said I'd driven into hell itself. "Don't, ever. Folks see him, they say he's been there since before I was born. Tall man, hat pulled low, never moves, never speaks. Always gone by first light. Truckers swap stories, but nobody sticks around long enough to find out what happens if you stay." He drained his beer and added, "One guy tried. Left his rig idling and walked up to him, swore he was going to shake his hand. Never came back. They found his truck the next morning, still running, door wide open. No sign of him. Just boot prints leading up to the machines, and stopping cold." I laughed it off in front of him, but that night, alone in bed, I couldn't shake the thought. I hadn't seen a shadow. I had seen the reflection turn. And worst of all, when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the crunch of gravel in my head, like heavy boots taking one slow step toward me. That sound followed me into my dreams for weeks, and even now, sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I'll catch myself glancing into the mirror, half expecting to see a tall man in a cowboy hat sitting in the glow of my taillights waiting for me to stop again. The fog that night came off the Trinity River like a slow exhale, thick and milky, turning the pines along Highway 59 into looming shadows that seemed to lean over the road. I had been driving since dusk, coming back from Houston after a job I should never have taken, and by the time I hit the stretch near Livingston, I was alone on the road. The kind of alone where you start to feel like you're the last car in the state, maybe the last one in the world. My high beams cut through the soup, but not far, and every shape seemed uncertain, like the fog was rearranging the world just to keep me guessing. That was when I saw her. She stood beneath the harsh white floodlights of the rest stop on the east side of the highway. They hummed against the quiet, casting cones of pale light on the cracked pavement. She wasn't moving, just standing there with her long hair falling across her shoulders, a hairbrush in her hand. A white nightgown clung loose to her frame, billowing slightly even though there was no wind I could feel. The sight made me slow down almost without thinking, one foot easing on the gas, because she didn't look like someone waiting for a ride or stretching her legs. She looked like she'd wandered out of a dream, or worse, out of a hospital ward. Her skin was the kind of pale that catches the light and throws it back, almost glowing against the night. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching on loose gravel, and she didn't turn. She just kept brushing her hair, slow and deliberate, like I wasn't there. It was an odd motion, mechanical in a way, the kind of repetitive thing people do when they're too deep in their own head to know the world around them. I cracked the window, called out, "Ma'am, you need help?" Nothing. Just that brushing bristles dragging through strands that gleamed white in the light. I cut the engine. For a moment, all I heard was the buzz of the floodlights and the blood in my ears. Then she let the brush slip from her fingers. It should have fallen. I was close enough to see the way it spun as it dropped, the way the handle caught the light. But before it touched the pavement, before it could even bounce, once it was gone, Not fallen into a crack, not lost in the fog, just gone like someone had yanked it out of the air. My throat dried instantly, and when I blinked, she was no longer brushing. Her arms hung slack at her sides, her head tilting in a way that made my stomach twist. I thought maybe she would look at me then, acknowledge me, but she didn't. She didn't move at all. Something in me screamed to drive away, but I opened the door instead. Gravel shifted under my boots, loud in the silence. I walked toward her slowly, each step heavy, deliberate, as if the air itself was trying to hold me back. The closer I got, the worse it felt. The temperature dropped in a way that made the fog sting against my skin, my breath puffing white even though the October night hadn't been near freezing before. The woman smelled faintly of damp earth, like freshly turned soil after rain. I said, "Ma'am, do you need me to call someone?" My voice sounded smaller than I meant it to, swallowed up by the fog. Then she turned. Not all at once, not like a living person would. Her head shifted first, slow and creaking, the long strands of her hair dragging across her cheek as if reluctant to follow. Her body followed a beat later, jerky and uneven until she was facing me fully. Her eyes weren't right. They weren't wide and desperate or narrowed with anger. They were blank, like river stones, catching just enough of the light to glint. She smiled then, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reaches a person's eyes. It was thin, practiced, like she was imitating something she had seen long ago and forgotten the meaning of. I stepped back, my boots crunching. Her mouth opened wider and wider as though she might say something, but no sound came. Just that awful grinding silence. Then I realized the floodlights were flickering. One by one, the tall poles hissed and dimmed, until only the one above her stayed lit. And in that moment, I thought I saw shapes in the fog beyond the light, figures tall and still, pressed close to the edge of the glow, waiting, watching. My chest tightened and my legs finally listened to the part of me that had been begging to run. I backed toward my car, fumbling with the keys, not daring to turn, my back. Her arms began to rise, elbows bending unnaturally like a puppet pulled on strings. The nightgown shifted against her frame, showing the outline of ribs that looked sharper than they should. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the lock down, just as she took one slow step forward. The brush was in her hand again. My headlights caught the gleam of it, though I knew with the kind of bone-deep certainty you can't argue with that it had never touched the ground. She lifted it, pulled it through her hair, and in the sweep of bristles I heard something, like a whisper, faint but urgent, too many voices all at once. My stomach lurched. I twisted the ignition, and the engine roared to life. She didn't move fast. She didn't need to. As I pulled out of the lot, tires spitting gravel, she just stood there beneath the light, brushing her hair with that vanishing brush, smiling her empty smile. The shapes in the fog didn't follow me, but I swear I felt their eyes pressing against my back all the way to Lufkin. By the time I dared to check the rear view, the fog had closed over the rest stop entirely, swallowing it whole. The floodlights had gone out. For years I told myself it was exhaustion or stress or some trick of the light. But 2 weeks later, a coworker swore up and down that on his way back from a fishing trip near Livingston, he saw a pale woman in a nightgown brushing her hair beneath the floodlights. He said she dropped the brush, and when he bent down to pick it up, it wasn't there. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I didn't have to. Some things don't need to be compared to know they're the same. And whenever I drive Highway 59 at night, I roll my windows up tight, keep my eyes dead, ahead, and pray I never see her again. Because the night she finally looks me straight in the eyes, I know I won't be able to drive away. The desert highways of Big Bend country stretch out like black ribbons under a sky so vast it feels like it might swallow you whole. There are stretches of road out there where the nearest town is 70 miles in either direction, and the only company you have is the glow of your headlights, the crunch of gravel under your tires when you pull over, and the whispers of the wind moving through the scrub. People who don't know the land think it's empty, but the longer you're out there, the more you realize how alive it is. Alive in ways you don't always understand. Alive in ways that can scare the hell out of you if you're out past midnight. I learned that one night when I was driving west on Highway 385, heading toward Marathon after a job that kept me too late in Presidio. I was halfway through that lonely stretch between Fort Stockton and Marathon when I noticed the lights behind me. At first I thought nothing of it. Other drivers pass through even if it's rare at night. The beams were far off. A faint glow that shimmered through the low-lying dust kicked up by the wind. I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting them to gain on me, but they held steady about a mile back, sometimes dimming as if whoever was behind me had dipped their brights, sometimes flashing stronger, as though the road bent in ways it didn't. I rolled down the window, let the cool desert air slap me awake and tried to ignore it, but after 10 minutes the lights hadn't changed. That's when I noticed something wrong. They were too high. The beams weren't fixed like headlights should be. They wavered, shifted, but always pointed straight at me. A car climbing a hill, you'd expect that, but the land out here is flat as a griddle for miles. I pressed harder on the gas. My old Chevy groaned but picked up speed, the hum of the tires louder against the asphalt. The lights behind me surged too, closing the gap as if responding to my speed. My heart started hammering, not because I thought someone was following me, but because of the silence. Out here, even on an empty road, you should hear an engine, especially one pushing that fast. There was nothing, just the wind, the tires, and those damned lights sliding closer in my mirror. By the time they were 100 yards back, I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled hard to the side, gravel spraying and killed my headlights. The desert swallowed me up in a rush of dark. I waited, staring at my mirror, my breath fogging the glass. The lights didn't slow. They bore down on me, two beams burning brighter and brighter until they should have lit up the back of my car, and then they were gone, just blinked out. 1 second they were almost on top of me, the next there was nothing but black road stretching empty behind. I sat there shaking, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd been dozing at the wheel, but the smell kept me anchored. Burning rubber, sharp and acrid, filling the cab of my truck. I stepped out and felt the heat radiating off the asphalt. When I aimed my flashlight down, I saw the marks. 2 long streaks of scorched pavement, blacker than the blacktop itself, stretching straight through where the lights had been, and ending right at my bumper like something had skidded to a stop and then simply vanished. I should have turned around right then, but I didn't. You get stubborn when you're tired, when you're out in that empty land with nothing but a cooler of warm Dr. Peppers and a long road ahead. I got back in, started the engine, and kept driving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the dark had teeth now. That every time I looked in the rear view, those lights would flare back up and come screaming down on me again. And they did. Twice more that night. Once near Alpine, once just outside of Marathon. Each time the same. The glow, the chase, the silence, the scorch marks left behind when they disappeared. It wasn't just me. When I pulled into Marathon, I stopped at the one all-night gas station, and the guy behind the counter asked me where I'd been. I told him. He nodded like he'd heard it 100 times. Said they called it the devil's headlights out there. Some folks claimed it was the ghosts of oilfield workers killed in a crash back in the 50s, their rig bursting into flames on a lonely stretch of road. The fire so hot it melted the asphalt. Others swore it was something older, something tied to the land itself, to the way the desert bends light and sound. He showed me a notebook they kept behind the counter, filled with names and dates, people who'd stopped in with the same story. The scorch marks were always the same. I signed my name in the book, but my hand shook so bad it barely looked like mine. That was years ago, and I don't drive through Big Bend at night anymore. Not alone. Not if I can help it. I tell myself, it was just a trick of the eyes, heat mirages, desert madness. But then I remember the heat under my boots, the smell of burnt rubber that lingered in my cab for days. I remember standing out there in the silence with my flashlight shaking in, my hand staring at marks on the road that couldn't have been left by anything solid. And the worst part, the part that gnaws at me even now, is that sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I hear it again. The hiss of tires that aren't there, the low hum of something rushing up behind me, chasing, always always ready to burn itself into the road and vanish before I can turn and see. Highway 6 has a way of making you feel smaller than you are, like the road swallows you mile by mile. I was driving through on a late October night, heading south past Calvert. Nothing but farmland and black sky pressing in from both sides. The gas gauge had dipped lower than I liked, so I pulled into a tired old rest stop. The sodium lamps outside the restroom flickered the way they do in places that haven't seen real upkeep in years, the glow casting everything in a kind of gray, sickly color. I remember thinking it looked abandoned, even though the trash cans were full and a fresh sweep of gravel crunched under my boots when I stepped out. The men's restroom door was heavy, painted steel with peeling green enamel. It groaned when I pushed it open, echoing down the tiled corridor. The smell hit me first, not the usual sour mix of disinfectant and piss, but something damp and old, like a cellar where rainwater has been trapped for years. The air carried a strange weight, and I figured I'd make it quick. It was late, I was tired, and all I wanted was to piss and get back on the road. But when I turned the corner into the row of stalls, I froze. Every single stall door was shut, each one latched tight. There were 6 in total, and all the little metal locks were slid into place. It struck me as odd because there hadn't been another car outside. I waited, half expecting to hear toilets flushing or the shuffle of feet, but the restroom was dead quiet. Dead, except for one thing. A sound I almost convinced myself I imagined. Breathing. Not one set. Not a person coughing or clearing his throat, but steady inhalations, slow and damp, seeping through the cracks at the tops of the doors. All 6 stalls, all locked and all of them breathing. My skin prickled under my shirt. I called out something stupid like, "Anybody in here?" My voice bounced off the walls, came back hollow, but nothing answered. Just the breath. I tried. The first door gave it a rattle. Locked. The second. Locked. Each one resisted with a stubborn finality, metal scraping against metal as if someone was holding it from inside. By the time I reached the last stall, I was sweating, and I realized I hadn't actually heard a single shuffle or shift, only that rhythmic inhale and exhale. It was too uniform, too perfectly timed, like an unseen tide moving through all 6 at once. I crouched down, thinking I could just check under the doors, confirm someone was actually in there. My knees popped against the cold tile and I leaned, low. Nothing. Every stall I looked under was empty, just bare concrete floors, dust gathering at the corners. But the breathing didn't stop. It got louder, like pressing a seashell to your ear, except wet and labored, dragging on my nerves, until my throat dried. I told myself it was pipes, maybe air moving through vents, some mechanical fluke. But then I noticed the locks. From beneath the stalls, I could see the inside of the doors. The bolts weren't slid across from within. They were loose, dangling. All 6 latches had been locked from the outside. Still, they were sealed tight as if an unseen hand held them in place, mocking the useless hardware. Panic set in. I stood up too fast and felt dizzy, the tiles swimming under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Against my better judgment, I decided to crawl under one, prove to myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing there. The middle stall seemed as good as any. I pressed my palms flat to the floor, forcing myself under the gap. The tile was sticky, grime smearing my shirt, and for 1 second I almost stopped, but I pushed through. When I pulled myself into the stall and rose up, I found it empty, just as I knew it would be. Only the breathing was louder now all around me, not outside, not above, but in that stall circling me. I turned in place, pressing my back against the cool metal divider. The air felt heavier, thick enough to choke. Then the lock on the stall door clicked, not from my side, from the other. I watched it slide into place, slow and deliberate, as if someone were watching me through a slit and wanted me to know I wasn't leaving. The hair on my arms lifted, every instinct screaming at me. I grabbed the latch, rattled it until my hands ached, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of breathing swelled, 6 lungs pulling in air from nowhere, drawing closer, converging. In the mirror above the sinks, Barely visible through the narrow opening of the stall, I caught movement. A shadow moved between the stalls, dragging itself along the gaps. It wasn't shaped right, too tall, too thin, bending in ways that didn't line up with joints. I froze, watching it move closer, the reflection warping as if the glass itself hated the thing it had to show me. The breathing turned ragged, then layered, hundreds of gasps spilling together, crowding the room with noise. I don't remember deciding to move. My body did it for me. I dropped, hit the ground, and slid under the stall door with every ounce of strength I had. The moment my shoulders cleared the gap, I felt the air shift like a rush of heat chasing me. The breath exploded into something worse, a gurgling groan that filled my skull. I scrambled to my feet, didn't look back, and ran. The steel door to the restroom slammed against the wall as I burst through it, sprinting to my car. The lamps outside flickered so hard they went dark for a heartbeat, and in that darkness I swore I heard the stalls slam open, one after another, a cannonade of hollow doors. I didn't stop to check. My hands shook so badly I barely got the keys in the ignition. Gravel spat out from under my tires as I tore onto the highway. The rearview mirror was angled down at the seat, but I didn't adjust it. I didn't want to see what might be following. It wasn't until I hit College Station an hour later that I dared to pull over at a gas station, this one lit and busy, with real people filling up their tanks. I went inside, washed my face in a crowded restroom, and forced myself to look in the mirror. Nothing unusual stared back, just me, pale and trembling. But here's the part that's never left me. My shirt was damp from crawling on that filthy tile, but it wasn't just grime staining the fabric. 6 perfect smears, as if pressed by wet fingers, streaked across my chest. And faintly, even now, sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can still hear it, that breathing deep and slow waiting for me to crawl back under. Highway 6 runs like a black scar through Brazos Valley, a road I've driven more times than I can count. But the stretch near Navasota has always carried a weight in the air that I can't quite put into words. When I was younger, I thought it was just the humidity, the way the air clings to your skin and makes your shirt damp even at midnight. But later in life, I came to realize it was something else, something heavier. I had camped all over Texas, from the pine woods to the desert flats, but that night I stopped near a little rest area outside Navasota. I wasn't looking for anything more than a place to stretch out and kill a few hours before, driving on. The lot was cracked asphalt, yellow paint lines faded nearly white, with a row of pecan trees at the back. I pulled in, parked under one of the floodlights, and shut off the engine. The sound of cicadas pressed in, the chorus so loud, it felt like static in the skull, but after a while it sank into the background like it always does when you're out in the country. I cracked open the windows to let the air circulate, leaned the seat back, and tried to drift off. It was around midnight when I first heard it. The faintest sound at first, almost like wind catching an empty can, but then the notes shaped themselves, tugging into something human-made. Accordion music. Not the kind you hear at a family barbecue, but something slower, drawn out with a mournful pull that carried across the lot like fog. My first thought was that someone else had pulled in and was listening to music in their truck. But when I sat up and scanned the lot, every other space was empty. The road beyond was dark, no headlights coming, no taillights leaving. I sat there holding my breath, listening as the accordion swelled, notes climbing like a prayer and then falling back into a kind of sigh. It was beautiful, but wrong in a way I couldn't name. Every hair on my arm stood straight. I opened the door, thinking maybe the sound carried from somewhere further off, maybe a ranch house tucked behind the trees. The instant my boots hit the pavement, the music cut off. Dead silence, except for the cicadas and the buzz of the floodlights. I stood there looking around like an idiot, waiting for it to pick back up, but nothing. Finally, I climbed back into the truck, shut the door, and almost on cue, the music started again. Soft at first, as if it had been waiting for me to settle back inside. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I slid over to the passenger side and cracked that window too, sticking my head out to catch the direction of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, spilling over the lot in invisible waves. That's when I realized I could almost hear a voice beneath it. Not singing, not speaking, but whispering along with the melody like breath pushing the bellows itself. I sat frozen, my hand tight on the seatbelt buckle, listening as the song curled and broke, winding through minor chords that seemed to sink deeper and deeper inside my chest. I told myself it was just exhaustion, the long drive messing with my head, and I pulled my sleeping bag over me, determined to ignore it. But then I felt the air in the cab shift. A coolness seeped in, not like a breeze through the window, but like the temperature dropped by 20 degrees in a blink. I could see my breath fog when I exhaled. The music was louder now, clearer, the kind of volume that should have meant someone was standing just outside the glass playing their heart out. But when I looked, the lot was empty. And then the whispering wasn't beneath the music anymore. It was inside the truck. It was in the air around my ears, threading through the melody. Not English, not Spanish, something older. The cadence was human, but the words slipped through my mind like oil, leaving a smear of dread behind them. My pulse hammered, and I yanked the door open again, stumbling out, ready to confront whoever was doing this. But the second my boots hit the pavement, the sound cut off again. Dead. The air went back to heavy and hot, like nothing had ever changed. I stood there in the harsh yellow light of the lamp, sweat rolling down my spine, trying to convince myself it was a dream. But my breath still smoked in the air, even though the night was thick and muggy. I didn't get back in the truck right away. I paced the lot, walking the cracked pavement to the tree line, checking the shadows, even shining my phone light into the branches. But there was nothing. When I circled back to the truck, the windows were fogged up from the inside like someone had been breathing in there, heavy and fast. I wiped the glass with my hand, opened the door, and slid back in. The cab smelled different. Damp. Like old wood left in the rain. I sat stiff, my back straight, waiting. For a long time there was only silence. I almost started to believe it was over, and that's when the music started again. This time it was a tune I recognized, an old ranchera my grandmother used to hum while cooking. The notes wavered, broken, but the song was unmistakable. My stomach turned because there was no way, no earthly way for that to happen. She had been dead for 15 years. Yet the melody carried the exact same rhythm, the same pauses, like she was there, coaxing it from the accordion bellows with her own hands. I whispered, "Stop," into the cab, my voice shaking. The music went on, ignoring me, rising to a fever pitch until the cab vibrated with the sound. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the music wasn't in the air anymore. It was in my head, worming through the bones of my skull, forcing me to remember things I didn't want to remember. Dark nights as a kid when she'd sing me to sleep, but her eyes would look past me, out into corners of the room like she saw something I didn't. The creak of her rocking chair even when no one sat in it. My hands trembled as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life and the music stopped like it had been cut with a blade. Silence, pure and crushing. I peeled out of that rest stop so fast I left rubber on the asphalt, the headlights slicing through the darkness as if they could burn away whatever had been clawing toward me. But the silence didn't last. 10 miles down the road past empty pastures and barbed wire fences, it started again. Faint this time, drifting through the speakers even though the radio was off. A low wheeze of bellows, a tug of notes like breath being forced through lungs that hadn't drawn air in decades. My throat closed up and I turned the volume knob, flipped every switch, but the radio was dead. The sound wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the engine, from the wheels, from the road itself, carrying through the chassis like the whole truck had become one giant accordion. I drove faster, praying speed would outpace it, but the song only swelled, drowning out the roar of the tires, filling my chest until I felt I couldn't breathe. I caught sight of my face in the rearview mirror, pale and dripping sweat, and for a split second, another face was layered over mine. Her face. My grandmother's. Eyes hollow, lips cracked but smiling as the music carried on. I jerked the mirror down, heart slamming, refusing to look again. By the time I reached the outskirts of Navasota, the music faded, tapering into silence like a curtain being drawn. The night was thick and ordinary again, the hum of tires steady beneath me. I pulled into a gas station, staggered out, and stood under the harsh fluorescent glow, trying to breathe. The attendant eyed me like I was drunk, but I didn't bother explaining. What could I say? That I'd been chased out of a rest stop by accordion music? That my dead grandmother had played me off the lot? I shook my head, got back in the truck, and drove until the sun came up, never stopping once. To this day, I won't pull over near Navasota. I won't camp anywhere close. Because sometimes when the night's quiet and I crack my window for a little breeze, I swear I still catch it. A faint strain of accordion, carried just enough on the wind to remind me, it's waiting and it knows me now. I was parked at a rest stop just outside Waco, my rig lined up with a dozen others under the yellow glow of security lights that always seemed a little too dim for comfort. I had been running since early morning, hauling refrigeration units out of Dallas, and by midnight my eyelids felt like lead weights. I killed the engine, stretched back in the seat, and let the drone of passing cars on I-35 fade into the background. The asphalt smelled hot and oily even though the night was cool, and a faint buzzing from the light poles was the only sound in the lot. It wasn't raining. It hadn't rained in days. The air was dry, carrying the dust of late summer across the highway. I remember that clearly because when I woke a few hours later, shivering at the sudden chill of pre-dawn air, the windshield of my truck was smeared with wet, streaky prints. I leaned forward, rubbing my eyes, and froze. They weren't streaks from condensation or dew. They were handprints, dozens of them, small, child-sized, pressed across the glass as if a crowd of kids had run their palms over it. The strange part wasn't just the size, though that was disturbing enough. It was the color. Each print was blue. Not dark navy, not faint smudges from chalk dust, but vivid sky blue like finger paint fresh from a kindergarten classroom. The streaks glistened in the weak lot lights, dripping faintly as if they'd been smeared on moments ago. My first thought was vandalism. Kids screwing around at the rest stop while I slept. But the lot was quiet. The only other trucker nearby was a guy snoring in a cab 2 spaces down. I climbed out, boots crunching gravel, and ran my hand over the glass. The smear was wet, tacky between my fingers, and left a faint stain on my palm. The smell hit me next, a sour chemical tang like old latex paint. I looked around, scanning the shadows by the picnic tables, the vending machines, the restroom, building. Nothing moved. Nothing but the insects flitting under the lights. I climbed back in and pulled out of there faster than I should have, heart hammering in my throat. I told myself it was a prank, some kind of blue grease or paint smeared by local teenagers. But when I stopped again later that week near Temple, the same thing happened. I woke from a restless nap and found a single perfect handprint in the middle of my windshield. The fingers were spread wide, pressed hard enough to leave faint lines where the ridges of the palm should have been. I didn't see or hear anyone approach my truck. The air was bone dry again, not a cloud in the sky, but the print was wet enough that a droplet ran slowly down the glass. That's when the other drivers started talking. Over coffee in the rest stop diner, I overheard 2 older truckers whispering about blue stains they'd found on their doors. One swore he'd seen a small figure dart across the lot one night, barefoot, leaving streaks of that same paint on the gravel. The other told me he'd woken to find a handprint not on his windshield but inside the cab, on the passenger seat window. I laughed along with them, pretending not to believe, but a chill settled in my gut that I couldn't shake. The more miles I logged along I-35, the more I noticed. Stories circulated at way stations over static-filled CB chatter. Drivers claimed to hear knocking on their doors at night, followed by the faint sound of children laughing, though no one was ever there. One man said he followed wet footprints into the restroom at a rest stop near Hillsboro, only to find the tiles spotless and dry. I tried not to think about it until it followed me home. After a week-long haul, I parked my rig outside my duplex in Denton. It was late, and the neighborhood was quiet, porch lights glowing soft against the dark. I climbed down, tired and irritable, and nearly dropped my keys. On the cab door at shoulder height was a blue handprint, larger than the others, too large for a child, too wide in the fingers. It glistened under the streetlight as though freshly painted, though there was no one in sight. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house set me on edge. I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see a smudge of blue on the glass. Days passed without incident, but I couldn't stop scanning my mirrors while driving. I'd catch glimpses of small figures by the roadside, too pale to be natural, vanishing when I looked directly at them. The final straw came 2 months later outside Austin. I'd pulled into a crowded rest area lined with rigs and family SUVs. Too many people around for anyone to sneak up on me, I thought. I locked the doors, pulled the curtain, and tried to nap. At some point I woke, the cab stifling hot, and felt the distinct pressure of a hand pressing against the glass behind me. Not a knock. A steady, lingering push, like someone laying their palm flat against the window. I turned slowly, throat dry, and saw the outline of a hand glowing faintly in the darkness. Blue, bright as fresh paint. The print lingered after the pressure eased. I stared at it until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. When I finally got the courage to wipe it away, the stain bled across my rag like ink, impossible to wash off. Even now, months later, I'll find faint traces on my windshield after a long run, especially when I take I-35 at night. Sometimes they're small, the size of a child's hand. Sometimes they're larger, always wet, always blue. No one has an answer. Not the old-timers, not the highway patrol. Some say it's the ghost of kids killed in an old bus wreck near the interstate, their paint-covered hands clawing for help. Others whisper about something older, tied to the land itself, something that marks travelers who linger too long in the dark. I don't care what the story is anymore. All I know is when the glass fogs in the night and the blue handprints appear, I don't stop to look. I just keep driving, praying they stay on the outside of the glass. Because if they ever show up inside the cab again, I don't think I'll make it through the night. I was headed south on Highway 77 late one evening, the kind of drive where the radio fades into static, and the road ahead becomes a dark ribbon unraveling under your headlights. It had been raining earlier, the storm clouds broken now, but the air still hung heavy with the smell of wet earth and asphalt. I'd been pushing myself, trying to make it past Victoria before midnight, but my eyes kept burning, my hands stiff on the wheel. When I saw the green exit sign for a rest area, I eased off the gas and pulled in. The lot was almost empty, just one old sedan parked under the buzzing orange floodlight and a semi-idling far off near the trucker's side. Inside the restroom, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, their glow uneven, shadows trembling across the tile. The smell of bleach and damp concrete clung to everything. I made my way to the sinks, turned the knob, and let the cool water run over my hands. It was quiet, except for the hum of the lights and the faint whoosh of the air vent. Then, as I rubbed the water across my palms, I heard it. Faint at first, just beneath the splash of the faucet, a soft, shuddering sound, like someone crying. I froze, leaning closer, thinking maybe one of the stalls was occupied. But when I glanced over, the doors were all ajar, the gaps dark and empty. The sound wasn't coming from the stalls. It was coming from the sink. I bent down, the water streaming clear against the white porcelain, and I swore I could hear the muffled sobs rising up from the drain. It was a woman's voice, soft but raw, the kind of weeping that carries years of grief in it. I straightened up fast, heart hammering, and twisted the knob off. The room fell quiet, except for the drips. I should have walked out right then, but something about it tugged at me, like a whisper brushing the back of my neck. I leaned down again, listening, and as if responding to my curiosity, the sobbing grew clearer, louder, until it echoed against the basin itself. I staggered back, staring at the sink like it might move. The air in the restroom felt heavier now, pressing on my chest. I splashed some of the water onto my face to wake myself up, but the second it hit, I realized the water had changed. It wasn't clear anymore. It was pink. My stomach lurched as the stream darkened, the color deepening until it ran the shade of rusted iron. The sobs turned into wails, sharp and desperate, filling the small space so completely I wanted to cover my ears. I stumbled back against the stalls, the sound shaking the tiles vibrating in my teeth. The red water churned in the sink, frothing like it was boiling, though the faucet was cold. Something darker seeped up from the drain, not just color but thickness, clotting as it swirled. The smell hit me then, metallic and sour, unmistakable. Blood. I wanted to bolt, but my legs wouldn't move. The crying was so loud now, it seemed, to come from the walls, the floor, even the mirrors above the sinks, which trembled faintly in their frames. I forced myself to glance at my reflection and saw, through the streaks of condensation, another face. Not mine. She was behind me in the glass. A woman's face, pale and waterlogged, hair plastered in strings across her cheeks. Her mouth was wide, open in a silent scream, though the sound kept pouring from everywhere else. Her eyes, glazed and milky, rolled up as if she were drowning all over again. I spun around, but no one stood there. The restroom was empty except for me and the red water pouring endlessly from the faucet. I slammed the knob shut, but the flow didn't stop. The sink overflowed, spilling crimson onto the floor, spreading across the tiles toward my boots. Panic snapped me loose, and I bolted out the door into the night air. The floodlight outside burned white against my eyes, and for a moment I thought I'd left it all behind. But when I glanced down, I saw my hands still wet from the sink. They were streaked with red, my palms sticky, the smell of iron clinging to my skin. I rubbed them against my jeans, but the stains wouldn't fade. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, and when I finally slid behind the wheel, I refused to look back at the restroom building. I drove hard back onto the highway, tires squealing as I merged onto the blacktop. The further I got, the calmer the air felt, the night stretching silent again. But the stain on my hands never faded. I scrubbed them raw later that night at a hotel. But no matter how much I washed, the smell lingered, sharp and metallic, seeping into my skin. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it, the fatigue of the drive warping my senses, but weeks later I heard about a woman who'd gone missing along that same stretch of Highway 77. They found her car abandoned at the rest area, door unlocked, purse still inside. They never found her body. Only thing the cops mentioned was the sink in the women's restroom, where the pipes were clogged so bad with some kind of dark sludge, they had to be ripped out completely. Now every time I pass that highway, I can't help but picture her face, drowned in gray, staring back at me in the glass. And when I wash my hands, no matter where I am, I always listen to the basin, bracing for the sound of someone weeping underneath, waiting to drag me down with her. The stretch of I-40 outside Amarillo always felt lonelier than it should, as if the plains themselves leaned away from it, letting the asphalt run on its own without company. There's nothing but scrub and flat land for miles. No trees, no buildings, just low grass whispering in the wind and the occasional pump jack bowing its steel head. People drive it fast because there's nothing to look at and nothing to slow for, unless you happen to pass the rest area near mile marker 76, the one with the long exit ramp sloping down into a gravel lot. That's where I saw her the first time and where I made the mistake of stopping. I was hauling a load of produce out of Lubbock, running tired but not enough to shut down. The sun had dropped behind the flat horizon and left behind that strange orange glow that makes every shadow look sharper. I was nursing a cup of gas station coffee gone cold when I noticed a shape standing near the ramp. From a distance, it looked like any hitchhiker, thin, still, waiting for a ride. I slowed without meaning to, and that's when I realized it was a girl. Barefoot. Her hair hung straight, maybe shoulder length, and her dress was plain, the kind of light cotton you'd expect to see in an old photograph. She wasn't waving, wasn't holding a thumb out. She was just standing there smiling. Now I've seen enough of the road to know when something's off, and right away I felt it. Her face was tilted up at me as if she'd been waiting, but the smile was wrong. It stretched too wide across, her cheeks too many teeth showing. The kind of smile that feels like a mask. I passed her and glanced in my mirror, and for a split second it looked like her head turned too far to keep me in view. The way owls do. I told myself I'd been awake too long, and by the time I pulled into the rest area, I'd almost forgotten. Her almost. The lot was empty except for one pickup with a camper shell and an 18-wheeler idling with its lights off. I killed my engine, stepped down, stretched my legs, and headed toward the vending machines by the bathrooms. The night was so still you could hear the insects buzzing against the fluorescent bulbs. I bought a bottle of water, leaned against the concrete wall, and tried not to think about the girl at the ramp. But then I heard footsteps on the gravel, soft and deliberate, like bare soles pressing down one after another. I turned, expecting maybe a kid from the pickup or a stray dog. But it was her. The same girl I'd seen by the ramp, only now she was 10 feet away, smiling that same stretched grin, her teeth catching the pale light. She didn't blink. Her eyes reflected the vending machine glow as if there were glass over them. My first thought was to ask if she needed help, if she was lost, but the words dried up in my throat. The smile grew wider, impossibly wide, the corners tugging toward her ears. I dropped the bottle and climbed back into my cab faster than I cared to admit. I locked the doors and told myself to just get moving, but when I turned the key, the truck stalled. Once, twice. On the third try, the engine caught, and when the dash lights flicked on, I saw something smeared across the inside of my windshield. A wet handprint. Small, like a child's, with long, thin fingers pressed flat against the glass. I swiped it with my rag, but it left no trace. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pulled out, gravel spitting behind me. Back on the interstate, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see her sitting in the jump seat or standing in the sleeper. I didn't. But somewhere between Amarillo and Vega, I realized I could still see her smile. Not in the cab with me, not in the glass, but burned into my mind as if I'd stared too long at the sun. Every time I blinked, the image came back. Her pale face, her bare feet, her too wide grin. I drove through the night with the radio on full blast, anything to drown out the thought of her. Later, at a truck stop west of Albuquerque, I told another driver about it. He didn't laugh. He just shook his head and said, "You seen the smiling girl? According to him, she's been showing up near that rest area for years, always barefoot, always grinning. Folks who stop sometimes don't start their engines again. A trooper once found a sedan abandoned at the ramp, doors open, belongings inside. No sign of the driver. Another time, a couple was found walking down, the shoulder in shock, saying they'd pulled over to help a girl who vanished when they blinked. Nobody knows who she was, or if she ever was. But everybody knows the smile. That's what sticks. The smile too wide for a human face. I wish I could tell you I forgot about it after a while, that it was just a story to scare rookies. But that isn't the truth. I keep running that road, and every time I pass the exit, I slow down against my better judgment. Sometimes the ramp is empty, sometimes it isn't. A few weeks ago, I saw her again, standing in the same spot, barefoot, smiling up at me. And this time, she raised her hand, like she knew me, like she remembered. I kept driving, eyes straight ahead, but when I blinked, I swear I saw her closer, as if the distance between us had collapsed in a heartbeat. Now, whenever I park at night, I check my windshield. Sometimes it's clean. Sometimes I find faint smears the size of a small hand, streaked across the glass as if someone pressed their palm against it while I was sleeping. I wipe them away before daylight, because I don't want anyone asking questions. But I know what they are. She's still out there, waiting by the ramp outside Amarillo, smiling too wide, and she isn't finished with me. I was driving west out of Amarillo when the storm warnings crackled over the radio, static swallowing the voice halfway through each sentence. The panhandle was stretched wide open around me, endless miles of flatland rolling out beneath a sky swollen with dark clouds. It was that peculiar Texas twilight where the horizon still burned faint orange, but the land itself had already gone dark, shadows pooling in the mesquite windbreaks and the ditch grass shivering in the wind. I'd been running on gas station, coffee for hours, and finally pulled into one of those lonely highway rest stops you only find out here, where the wind rattles the metal picnic covers and you can smell cow manure riding the air even when no cattle are in sight. The sign said, "Rest area, 2 miles," and the lights, when I reached them, were buzzing against the storm like insects in glass. There was a squat brown brick restroom building set back from the parking lot, the same style they've used since the 70s. The sodium lamps threw weak yellow cones across the empty lot. I parked my truck under one close to the building because I had a bad habit of locking my keys inside and I wanted light if I had to fish around. The prairie was endless in every direction, flat fields that seemed to hum with the wind. A semi roared by on the highway, Dopplering into the distance. And then it was just me and the moan of the storm pressing closer. Inside the restroom it was bright and hollow, the echo of the tiled walls carrying every sound like a shout. The smell was the familiar cocktail of ammonia and old water, and that sour tang you only get in places like this. I relieved myself quickly, washed my hands, and splashed some cold water on my face, thinking I looked as worn as I felt. My own reflection under the fluorescent lights seemed oddly distorted, stretched at the edges of the mirror like the glass was bowing outward. My eyes looked too dark. I told myself it was the poor light, the storm shadow in my head from driving too long. I pushed open the heavy door, stepped outside, and stopped dead. Where the parking lot had been, where my truck had been sitting under the light, there was nothing but open prairie. Endless dry grass, bending and rattling in the storm wind. No asphalt, no concrete sidewalks, not even the hum of the highway. Just raw land. The restroom behind me was gone too when I spun around. I was standing in knee-high grass with a cold sky flattening above me, and there wasn't a single structure anywhere I could see. For a minute I thought maybe I'd gone insane, driving too long, eyes playing tricks. I stumbled forward, expecting to trip over the curb, but there was nothing under my boots but earth and brittle stalks. I shouted into the distance and the sound went nowhere, swallowed in the wind. The horizon stretched for miles, no lights, no signs, no semis on the road, nothing but that dark rolling sky. Panic doesn't hit you all at once. It trickles in, a little pulse in your throat, your skin prickling as if it knows something your mind can't accept yet. I walked in circles, looking for the parking lot, the bathroom, even the glow of the sodium lamps, but there was nothing. I even pinched the inside of my arm hard enough to raise a welt, certain I must have dozed off standing up. The sting told me I was awake. The prairie told me I was nowhere. I tried walking straight, picking a point on the horizon and forcing myself toward it, but the ground didn't change. 10 minutes, 20. The land stayed the same, an unbroken plain under the lowering storm. The wind carried the smell of dry dirt and something else like iron, sharp and metallic, stinging the back of my throat. The storm rumbled closer, a low vibration that seemed to come from beneath my feet instead of the clouds. I shouted again, hoping for an answer, and for a split second I thought I heard something like a voice carried back, but it wasn't a human sound. More like a mocking echo, twisted and hollow. The strangest part was when I turned back. I thought I could retrace. My steps head back to where I'd stepped out, but when I turned there were no footprints in the grass. Nothing to prove I'd walked there at all. It was as if the land had swallowed the memory of me. That was when I realized how quiet it really was, aside from the endless wind. No crickets, no coyotes, no nightbirds, just the hiss of grass bending in waves and the pulse of thunder rolling through a sky that didn't move closer and didn't move away. Time didn't feel right anymore. I checked my watch, and the hands hadn't moved. My phone was in my pocket, but it wouldn't turn on. The screen stayed black. I could feel the weight of it, dead as a brick. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into bone no matter how much you rub your arms. I thought of the stories I'd heard about people who vanish in the panhandle, the endless land swallowing them whole. Oil workers, drifters, families, stranded on back roads. They just go missing, and sometimes they're found miles from where they should be. Shoes gone, skin burned by the sun as if they'd walked for weeks. The prairie around me began to ripple, though the wind had not changed. The grass moved in patterns, circles that spread outward as if something were rising beneath it. I froze, my throat tight, and then I saw shapes forming in the distance. Dark vertical lines like poles. No, like walls. The brick walls of the restroom, standing up from the grass where they hadn't been before. The whole building coalesced out of the air, shimmering, buzzing faintly as though the light itself were vibrating. My truck appeared a second later, headlights on though I'd left them off, the engine idling. I ran, stumbling through the grass, desperate to reach it, to put my hand on the steel door and feel something solid again. But the closer I got, the more it shimmered, the more it seemed to waver. The truck flickered, the walls wavered, and then the door of the restroom opened by itself. A figure stepped out. It looked like me. Same jacket, same boots, same walk. Only the face wasn't mine. The smile was too wide, the eyes too dark. It turned, saw me, and for a moment we both stood in the prairie with the storm pressing down, watching each other. Then it stepped away from the building and the restroom behind it vanished again, leaving nothing but grass and sky. The figure remained, smiling across the space between us, and I realized the storm wasn't above anymore. It was inside my ears, a roar like blood rushing, drowning out everything. I don't remember how I got back to my truck. All I know is I blinked and I was sitting behind the wheel, knuckles white on the steering wheel, the parking lot wet under, the storm's first rain. The restroom stood solid behind me in the mirror. The highway hummed with a passing semi. My watch read the same time it had before. I turned the key, the engine coughed, and I drove off without looking back. But even now, weeks later, when I close my eyes, I can smell that iron tang and hear the prairie hissing. And I know the next time I stop at a rest area out here, the door might not lead back where I came from. It might lead me straight into the empty land, where the toilets vanish and the only thing waiting is the version of me that smiles too wide. The first time I saw it was late on a Friday night in early October, when the wind carried a bite that smelled like mesquite and dry grass. I'd been driving Highway 281 for hours, cutting south through the hill country after a job in Wichita Falls, tired enough that my eyes stung every time a passing semi's headlights washed over me. Gas was running low, the kind of low where the needle doesn't hover politely above empty but hides below it like it's ashamed. I should have stopped back in Stephenville, but I told myself I'd make it to Johnson City and fill up there. The road can trick you that way, stretching quiet and endless between one place and the next, making you think you'll coast just a little farther. That's when I saw the glow. Not the fluorescent wash of a modern gas station, but something older, softer, a pale green that looked half dead even from the highway. I slowed, thinking maybe I was hallucinating, but as I turned off the blacktop onto a cracked strip of concrete, I saw what it was. A single pump. The kind with a rounded top and glass panels on either side. The kind my father used to talk about, from when he was a boy. Behind it sat the shell of a station, windows gone, roof sagging like a drunk trying to keep upright. No sign or logo except a faint red circle painted on the brick wall, sun faded until it could have been anything. But that pump was alive. Its numbers ticked slow and steady like a heartbeat. The wheel inside turning with a dry little click I could hear even through the rolled-up windows. I pulled closer and left the engine idling. The place looked abandoned decades ago, grass sprouting. Through the lot, tin sign poles leaning like they were too tired to hold anything up. But that glow around the pump, it didn't come from a bulb I could see. It was more like the paint itself gave off light, a ghostly shine bleeding into the night. I should have kept going. I know that now. But desperation makes a man stupid, and the needle on my dashboard was begging for mercy. I stepped out and the air hit me. Cold, sharper than it should have been for early fall. There was no sound, not the hum of crickets or the distant chorus of coyotes that usually follow you on Texas nights. Just wind-rattling dry weeds against the concrete. I walked to the pump and rested a hand on its metal side. It was warm. Too warm, like something alive under there. The numbers rolled as I touched it. Little black wheels with white digits, clicking, slow as if someone invisible was filling a tank. The hose lay coiled neatly, nozzle hanging on the hook, spotless despite the rust on everything else. When I lifted the nozzle, the ticking stopped. Silence dropped over the place like a blanket. My reflection in the glass pane of the pump looked off, fuzzed at the edges, like the glass was full of fog on the inside. I didn't want to hook it into my car. I didn't want to, but my hands moved like they belonged to someone else. The nozzle slid into my tank, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, thin and low, the kind you can't quite catch but you know it's speech. It rose and fell with the roll of the numbers, syllables slipping between the clicks. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before, but I understood it anyway. The way you understand the growl of a dog without words. I yanked the nozzle free and gas sprayed across my boots, cold and sharp-smelling, but when I looked down, there was nothing. No wetness, no smell, just dust and cracked asphalt. The numbers on the pump kept spinning even though I hadn't touched it again. Faster now, clicking like teeth chattering in the cold. And the whispers grew clearer. They weren't just one voice anymore. They were dozens. Men, women, even children, talking over each other in a jumble that made my head ache, all threading through the dry Texas night. I backed toward my car, and that's when the air shifted. Heavy, like a storm was about to break. But the sky above was cloudless, stars bright, and sharp as nails. My headlight stretched across the old storefront behind the pump, and in the broken windows I saw shapes. Faces pressed up against the glass, pale and hollow-eyed, watching. They didn't move, didn't blink, just stared like they'd been waiting for me all along. I got in the car and twisted the key so fast I nearly broke it. The engine coughed, hesitated, then caught with a roar that felt like salvation. I slammed it into drive and floored it, gravel spitting behind me. But in the rearview mirror, the pump was still there, glowing faint and steady, its numbers rolling even faster, blurring into a spinning wheel of light. For a second, just a second, I saw one of those faces reflected in the mirror, not behind me in the building, but sitting in the back seat, lips moving in time with the whispers. I didn't dare turn around. I just drove until the glow vanished and the darkness of the hill country swallowed everything again. By the time I hit Johnson City, the tank was full. I hadn't stopped anywhere else. I hadn't pumped a drop. But the needle was pressed against the F like I'd just filled up. I pulled over under the lights of a modern station, my hands shaking, and checked the cap. Dry. No smell. Nothing to prove what I'd just seen. But the odometer on my dash had changed. Rolled backward, numbers spinning in a way they shouldn't have, like the car itself had been rewound. I never take that stretch of 281 at night anymore. Sometimes I'll hear from other drivers, truckers mostly, about a glow out past Marble Falls, an old pump that still ticks when everything else around it is dead. They laugh about it, the way men laugh about things they don't want to believe. But when they laugh, their eyes shift like they've heard the whispers too. Like maybe they stopped once and filled up, and now they're still carrying something with them they'll never shake. I keep the radio loud on that road now, louder than I need, and I don't look left when the brush parts and a faint green glow leaks across the highway. Because I know if I look, if I stop again, the voices won't just whisper this time. They'll call me by name. Out past San Angelo, where the mesquite grows in crooked clusters along the two-lane stretches and the air at night tastes like dust and motor oil, there's a sign that reads mile marker 87. It doesn't look different from the others, just another green rectangle fixed to a silver post, the numbers stamped bold in white. But if you drive through there late enough, when the crickets have gone quiet and the sky is nothing but black satin dotted with faraway stars, you'll see what I saw. And once you've seen it, you won't ever forget. You'll wish you could. It was a humid August night, the kind that makes your shirt stick to the back of your seat even with the window cracked. I was heading back from a delivery job that had run long in San Angelo, trying to make it back to Abilene before sunrise. My radio was tuned to some local station that faded in and out with the hills, static rolling in like waves between songs. It was close to 2 in the morning when I passed a feed store with its lights off and then nothing but road. Highway 87 is long and straight in parts, but there are dips where the land folds in on itself, and in those valleys the darkness thickens. I was coming up on one of those places when I saw it. At first I thought it was a deer. Something pale was low too, the ground moving odd, jerky, My high beams cut over it and I realized it was a person. A person on their hands and knees crawling dead center of the lane. My stomach clenched and I swerved hard to the right, tires spitting gravel from the shoulder. I gripped the wheel, cursing, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. The figure didn't turn, didn't stop, just kept crawling slow, deliberate, like they were dragging themselves forward through mud I couldn't see. I hit the horn, long and sharp. No reaction. I leaned forward, squinting through the glass. What I caught in that sliver of light still makes me cold when I remember it. Its face, if it was a face, was pressed to the asphalt. The skin was too white, like paper soaking through with something underneath. The arms looked too long, elbows lifting high like grasshoppers' legs. I swear I saw fingers bending the wrong way as they scraped the road. My truck passed it, and then I was alone again in the rear view, shaking, muttering to myself, convincing myself it was some drunk who'd stumbled out too far from town, or some poor soul half crazy and lost. Then the radio erupted. It wasn't just static this time. It was violent, ripping static, the kind that claws at your eardrum. I yanked the dial, but every station, even the ones I knew didn't reach that far, were nothing but a roaring, snapping hiss. Underneath, I thought I heard voices. Not words exactly, but the rhythm of voices. High and low, men and women talking all at once, crowding each other, as if 100 people had been jammed into the same frequency. My hand shook on the knob. When I turned the radio off, the static didn't stop. It kept pouring from the speakers like the machine had been hijacked. I smacked the dash, shouting now, but nothing changed. It was as if that noise was inside the truck, inside me. I pressed the gas harder. The road stretched long and dark, nothing but the white lines rushing at me, but the sound only grew. The voices sharpened, clipping in sudden bursts, like angry whispers pressed against glass. Then my headlights flickered, just once, but enough that the whole world seemed to blink out for a fraction of a second. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached, staring forward, refusing to look at the mirrors. I didn't want to see if anything was behind me. When I finally made it into a lit stretch near Sterling City, the static cut off like a switch had been thrown. The speakers went dead quiet. My heart was still racing, my shirt damp, my throat raw from breathing too hard. I pulled into a gas station that was open 24 hours and just sat there in the cab, hands on my knees, until a clerk tapped the glass to see if I was okay. I told him I'd almost hit a deer. He nodded like he'd heard that excuse 100 times and walked away. But when I went inside to grab a bottle of water, he called after me, said, "You didn't see it near 87, did you?" His tone made my skin prickle. I asked him what he meant, and he just shook his head, said, "Don't drive out there alone no more," and rang me up without looking me in the eye. I couldn't let it go. I asked around over the weeks that followed, quiet at first, then less so. Most people brushed me off, but every now and then I'd catch someone's expression change when I said mile marker 87. A waitress in Bollinger told me her uncle had wrecked his truck near there after swerving to avoid something in the road. He was found with the radio still on, blasting static so loud the deputies had to disconnect the battery to shut it up. A farmer south of town swore his wife came home late one night in tears, saying she'd seen a pale child crawling across the asphalt, but when she stopped, it wasn't a child at all. She wouldn't say what it was. She wouldn't leave the house after dark for months. I even drove back out there once. Daylight, middle of the afternoon, sun beating down hard enough to make the pavement shimmer. I pulled over at the sign, got out, stood in the heat. Everything looked normal. Mesquite, fence line, sky so wide it made you dizzy. I told myself I'd imagined it, that exhaustion and too much caffeine had made me hallucinate. But just before I climbed back into the cab, a semi roared past, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone in the road again, low and crawling, caught in the shadow under the trailer. When the dust settled, there was nothing there but the smell of hot tar and diesel. I drove home without turning on the radio. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving the quieter highways, the speakers in my truck crackle for no reason. Just faint at first, like the beginning of rain. I turn the knob, but it doesn't matter. I know if I keep listening long enough, I'll hear them again. Those voices, trapped and crowding, pressing against the glass. And when that happens, I don't dare look at the mile markers anymore. Because if I do, I'll see the number 87, staring back, and I know what waits there. Crawling, patient, waiting for headlights to sweep over it once more. I was driving Highway 21 late one night, the road stretching endless and black between Bastrop and Caldwell, when I first heard about her. Folks in town said if you drove that highway past midnight, sometimes you'd see her down in the ditch. A woman soaked in mud, crying for help, waving her arms like she'd been left for dead. I had chalked it up to just another one of those small-town ghost stories, the kind kids whispered about during sleepovers and old men swore by after 3 Lone Stars at the bar. But then one night I saw her for myself, and I swear to you, the memory hasn't left me since. It was late October, cool enough that the windows fogged when I breathed, but warm enough that the pavement still carried the day's heat in its bones. The highway was empty except for me, just the 2 glowing cones of my headlights stretching over the ribbon of asphalt and the pale smear of stars above. The trees crowded close on either side, the kind of tall East Texas pines that creak and sway even when the wind is light. I had the radio tuned low, some old country station humming static-laced tunes, when I caught movement in the corner of my eye. She was there, crouched in the ditch off to the right, half hidden by weeds and shadow. A woman, long hair hanging wet and heavy, clothes plastered to her skin, her arms waving frantically. At first I thought it was a trick of the lights, some deer crashing through brush, but then I saw her face. Mud streaked across pale skin, eyes wild, and her mouth opening and closing in silent sobs. She looked like someone's wife or sister, not some phantom, but a real flesh and blood person who'd been left to die. Instinct took over before reason did. I eased onto the shoulder, gravel crunching beneath the tires, and threw the gear into park. She vanished, not in the blink of an eye, no shimmer, no fade, just gone. The ditch was empty, the weeds swaying, but nothing else. My heart punched hard against my ribs. I leaned across the seat and scanned the glass, searching the dark, telling myself she'd stumbled deeper down into the gully, maybe hidden by brush. But the world was quiet. No footsteps, no sobbing, no thrash of movement, just the tick of my cooling engine and the night insects buzzing in the weeds. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, and that's when I saw it. On the passenger side door, smeared across the white paint, were muddy handprints. 5. Fingers splayed wide, streaks sliding down as if someone had dragged themselves up to the window. The prints were fresh, wet enough that small clumps of clay flaked off when the breeze stirred. My gut tightened cold. No one had been close enough to touch my car. No one I could see anyway. I told myself I was tired, that I'd imagined it, that maybe I'd driven through a patch of mud earlier, and just now noticed. But when I pulled away, the radio crackled with static so loud it drowned out everything else. Not the soft fuzz you get when a signal drifts. This was a full-blown eruption, like white noise poured straight into the cab. I twisted the knob, smacked the dash, even shut it off, but the noise kept going, louder and sharper until I swore it was coming from inside my own skull. Only when I hit 70 and the road began to curve did it cut off, leaving silence so thick I felt dizzy. I didn't sleep when I got home. I scrubbed the car instead, hose in hand under the porch light, washing those muddy handprints again and again until the white paint shone. But the next morning they were back, faint, as if seeping up from under the surface. Like the car itself had been touched by something that couldn't wash away. The second time I saw her was 2 weeks later. Same stretch of road, same ditch, same frantic waving. But this time I didn't stop. I pressed my foot harder on the gas and kept my eyes straight ahead. Even so, the static poured through my speakers, and when I finally pulled into my driveway and climbed out, there were fresh handprints on both doors. People talk about her like she's a remnant of some tragedy, a woman run off the road years ago, left to die alone in the dark ditch where no one stopped in time. Others say she's something older, something tied to the land, using the shape of a woman to lure folks close. All I know is that if you see her, and you try to help, She follows you home. You'll wake in the night to the sound of water dripping, though no faucet leaks. You'll find streaks of mud across your porch steps or your windshield, though it hasn't rained in weeks. And you'll hear the low, static roar when the world is supposed to be quiet, as though she's still sobbing out there in the dark, searching for someone to pull her from the ditch. I never drove Highway 21 after midnight again. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is still, I swear I hear the sound of knuckles rapping against glass. Not loud, just the faint, wet tap of a hand trying to be let in. And in the morning, no matter how hard I scrub, the prints are always there waiting. I pulled off at rest stop 45 just outside of Corsicana, one of those concrete islands meant to give weary drivers a chance to piss, stretch, and check their phones before the next stretch of highway swallowed them up. It was close to midnight, a late October night with the kind of damp chill that clings to the skin, even though the thermometer would probably insist it was still 70. The fluorescent lights along the sidewalk hummed with that faint electric buzz, throwing pale pools of light across the parking lot. Crickets sang in the weeds, but under it there was a strange, distant silence, like the world had stepped a little too far away. There were cars, at least a dozen of them. Trucks with mud still caked along the sides, a couple sedans with cracked windshields, one big white SUV sitting at an angle like someone had pulled in fast. But when I walked past, stretching my legs, shaking the pins and needles out of my knees, I noticed something strange. Every single one of them looked empty. No silhouettes behind the glass, no glow from phones, no movement of people reclined in their seats. Just the dark, hollow look of abandoned vehicles. I told myself maybe their drivers were all inside at the same time, lined up at the vending machines or the bathrooms. That kind of coincidence happens. But when I glanced toward the little rest stop building, the place was dark. The soda machines glowed faintly, buzzing like the lights, but through the windows I didn't see a single soul. I circled back toward my own car, trying to ignore the way the back of my neck was prickling. That was when the headlights came on. Not mine. All of them. Every car in the lot blinked to life at the exact same moment. The sudden white glare flooded the asphalt and caught me right in the eyes. I shielded my face, stumbling back a step. Just as quick, they went dark again. The lot dropped back into that pale fluorescent gloom. The crickets stopped. My pulse started racing so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself it had to be some kind of trick. Maybe motion sensors, though I'd never seen cars rigged like that. Or maybe some local kids had wired something together, a prank to spook out travelers. I tried to laugh at the thought, though it came out thin. I walked faster toward my car. Then the lights blinked again. Every single one. At the same time. On, off, on, off. A rhythm now, slow at first, like a heartbeat. When I reached for my door handle, I froze. There were fresh smears on the window. Muddy handprints streaked across the glass, though I hadn't left the car long enough for anyone to touch it. I yanked the door open, slid inside, and slammed the lock down. The air inside felt damp, musty like wet leaves and old water. I'd left it clean. I was sure of it. The headlights began again, but this time the rhythm sped up, stuttering, all of them flashing together in a syncopated pulse that seemed almost intentional, like a code. I could see my reflection lit and unlit, my pale face jumping in the rear view. I twisted the key, the engine turning over, coughing. For a moment it wouldn't catch. My eyes darted to the windshield, half expecting to see figures rising from those cars, but the lot stayed empty. Just the lights flashing. Faster now. The engine roared to life and I floored it. My tires squealed on the concrete, and as I shot toward the exit, I glanced back. All those cars were still, dead dark again. Not a single headlight. Not a single door opened. Like nothing had happened. But 20 miles down the highway, when I finally slowed enough to breathe, I glanced at the side mirror. Faintly, barely visible against the shine of my taillights, I swore I saw other beams blinking in rhythm, far back on the horizon. And when I pulled into a gas station in Fairfield, under the bright glare of its floodlights, I caught sight of my car door again. The handprints were still there, only this time they weren't muddy. They were wet, smeared in something darker, something that hadn't been there when I left rest stop 45. And the worst part, when I tried to wipe them away with a rag from the pump, the stains didn't fade. They seemed to sink deeper into the glass, like the car had absorbed them. Like they belonged there now. I didn't finish the drive that night. I checked into a roadside motel, too wired to sleep but too scared to keep moving. I left the car parked under the sodium lamp, but all night I kept expecting to see the headlights flare in unison with some unseen command. The blinds rattled. In the thin wind, the room smelled faintly of mildew, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the lot full of empty cars waiting in silence. By morning the prints had dried into faint, shadowy outlines, still visible if you looked closely. I've washed the car since then, scrubbed it, polished it, even replaced the glass. It doesn't matter. In the right light I still see them, and when I drive past rest stops at night, I swear I catch flashes on the horizon, headlights that don't belong to any one vehicle but all move together like some living thing. And if I slow down, if I so much as think about pulling over, the rhythm begins again. On, off, waiting for me to stop long enough for them to catch up. The station sat in the middle of nowhere, a glowing island of buzzing fluorescent tubes surrounded on every side by flat black desert. West Texas at night has a way of pressing down on you. The horizon gone, the sky too wide, too empty, too quiet. I had been driving for 7 hours straight, the stretch between Fort Stockton and Van Horn, nothing but scrub and sand and the occasional lonely mile marker. The needle on my fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for longer than I liked, so, when the white sign with peeling red letters appeared out of the dark, fuel open 24 hours, I pulled off without thinking. The gravel crackled under my tires as I rolled up to the pump. It was one of those old stations with 2 squat fuel islands, the kind that hadn't been modernized yet, with faded decals and scratched glass panels that rattled when the wind pushed against them. The office was a single building with a convenience storefront, one side of it lit and the other lost in shadow. I didn't see anyone inside through the windows. The air smelled like dust and oil. I cut the engine, stepped out, and the silence of the desert pressed in against the thin hum of the lights. I slid my card, pressed the nozzle into the tank, and stood there as the gas began to flow, the numbers rolling on the old screen with that jerky rhythm you only hear at outdated pumps. The wind whistled across the highway and I felt my shoulders loosen for the first time all night. That was when I noticed the reflection. The glass panel above the pump was scratched to hell, but it still caught the light, and in it, clear as day, was the outline of a man standing directly behind me. He was taller than me by a head, broad-shouldered, and completely black as if no detail could catch. No hat, no coat, no features, just a thick human shape cut out of everything around it, pitch black against the fluorescent glow. My first thought was that someone had pulled in without me hearing, another traveler, maybe a trucker. But when I turned, the lot was empty. Nothing stood behind me but the whitewashed gravel, the highway stretching away, and the scrub grass bowing in the wind. I jerked back toward the glass. The shadow was still there, still standing exactly where I had been, still darker than any night around it. My throat tightened, and the pump handle slipped a little in my grip. I turned again, slow this time, sweeping the lot with my eyes. Nothing. Not a soul. The wind picked up, carrying sand across the pavement in skitters. I forced myself to breathe, told myself I was tired, that I'd been staring too long, that reflections at night can trick your mind. I fixed my eyes on the nozzle, willed the numbers to climb faster. The tank felt like it would never fill. When the pump finally clunked to a stop, I pulled the nozzle free, slid it back into place, and let my eyes flick one last time toward the glass. The shadow was closer now, not behind me exactly, but over my shoulder in the reflection, leaning forward as though watching my hands, the pitch black spilling almost into the curve of the pump. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over the hose. The gravel was still empty. My truck stood alone under the buzzing lights, its silver paint washed pale. The road beyond was vacant, nothing but that dark Texas desert stretching for miles. My skin was crawling. I shoved the cap onto the tank, yanked the door handle, and climbed in. I wanted to slam it shut, lock everything, peel out without looking back, but my body hesitated, eyes drawn once more to the glass. This time the shadow wasn't alone. In the reflection, 3 figures stood behind me, lined up shoulder to shoulder, blacker than the night they came from, still and tall. No movement. No detail, just presence. I snapped my eyes to the lot, heart hammering, mouth dry. The place was still empty. I fired the engine, the sound too loud, echoing off the little building and carrying out across the scrub. I backed out quick, tires slipping in the gravel, then turned hard onto the highway. The lights of the station shrank fast in the rear view, and for a second I thought I'd left it behind. That was when I saw it. The reflection in the rear view mirror didn't show my truck cab the way it should. It showed the station, the pumps, the glass. And in the glass, the figures still stood, still watching. Only now there were more of them. A crowd gathering, shapes pressed shoulder to shoulder, a whole line of shadows waiting. I almost ripped the mirror off, trying to tilt it away. My breath came short, hands white on the wheel. The highway stretched out ahead, empty and black, nothing but the steady hum of tires and the occasional glint of road signs. The station light finally dipped, below the horizon, swallowed by the desert. I told myself I was done with it, that it couldn't follow. But hours later, when I stopped at a truck stop outside El Paso to wash my face and clear my head, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. My reflection stared back, pale, sweat-beaded, eyes too wide. And there, behind my reflection's shoulder, stood one pitch-black figure, closer than before, and when I turned, as always, there was nothing. The night air along I-10 always carried a certain weight near El Paso, a dry heaviness that pressed down on the desert, making the silence between passing semis feel like it stretched on forever. I had driven that stretch more times than I could count, sometimes for work, sometimes just to get away, but I had never noticed the exact mile marker until the first time I heard it. They say it happens near mile 214, a flat and lonely piece of asphalt where the land runs wide and empty, the kind of emptiness that makes you glance at your gas gauge even if you just filled up. Out there, the desert seems to watch you. The scattered mesquite and cholla hold their ground like ancient sentinels, and the sky at night is so black it feels more like a lid shutting over the earth than a ceiling of stars. It was just past midnight when I slowed to take a sip from my water bottle, my headlights cutting a thin tunnel across the desert. That was when I heard it, tires screaming in panic. Not the dull screech you hear in city traffic when someone slams the brakes at a yellow light, but the raw, tearing cry of rubber shredding against pavement, a sound that makes your gut twist because it always comes right before the crash. I hit the brakes myself, half expecting to see brake lights ahead, but the road was bare, empty as far as my high beams reached. Still, the sound kept on, cutting through the stillness with that sickening pitch of something about to go horribly wrong. And then silence, quick as it started. My pulse hammered. I rolled down the window to listen. Nothing but the dry hiss of the wind moving over the desert brush. I sat there a while, staring into the darkness, waiting for another car. AE sign, anything, nothing came. Later, when I mentioned it at a gas station on the far edge of town, the clerk only raised his eyebrows and muttered, "That's the wreck spot. Family burned up there years ago." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him, but the way he said it, flat without surprise, made me realize it wasn't just a story to pass the time. It was something they all knew. Curiosity has a way of digging at you. Over the next weeks, I found myself driving that stretch again, almost daring the sound to come back. And it did. Every time, the same. That agonizing squeal, the echo of desperate braking, always at the same mile marker, always just past midnight. Sometimes it was faint, like it came from far down the highway. Other times it was so close I swore I could smell the heat of rubber on asphalt. Yet no matter how many times I pulled over, there was never a car, never skid marks, never a single trace. One night I stayed parked on the shoulder, engine off, window down, determined to catch something more. At 12:37 exactly, it came again, louder than ever. My whole car shook as if something had rushed past. Then clear as day I heard it. A scream, human this time, not just metal and rubber. A woman's voice cut short in the middle of it, like the desert swallowed her whole. My throat closed up and I started the car so fast I nearly flooded it, then peeled away down the empty road with the sound still ringing in my ears. I told myself I'd stop going, that whatever haunted that stretch of I-10 was none of my business. But something about the way the scream ended, clipped and unfinished, gnawed at me. It felt like an unfinished sentence begging for someone to hear it all the way through. A week later I found myself back again, heart hammering as I slowed, near the marker. This time, when the squeal rose out of the night, I kept my headlights trained dead ahead, white knuckles on the wheel. Out of the dark shimmer of heat on the asphalt, a shape flickered, brief, almost too fast to catch. A car, old and boxy, maybe a late 80s sedan, flickered like a mirage, swerving, headlights wild, then gone in an instant. The scream followed, sharper than ever, and then silence. When I told an older trucker friend about it, his face went pale. He said he'd driven that stretch the night of the crash, back in the 90s. Claimed a family of 4 went off the road. Tires locked, the car flipping before it burst into flames. The fire burned so hot the rescue crew couldn't pull the bodies out for hours. Folks driving by said they could still hear the tires long after the flames were out, like the sound of them dying had been etched into the road. That night I dreamed of it. I dreamed I was in the car, a woman in the passenger seat, 2 kids in the back. I could feel the panic, the steering wheel trembling in my hands, the helpless terror of sliding with no control. I woke up drenched in sweat, the phantom stench of burning rubber in my nose. And worse, when I checked the clock, it was 12:37. The exact minute the tires screamed on the highway. I don't know if the desert holds memories or if the road itself learned to replay that night forever. But I know this much. If you drive I-10 near El Paso after midnight and you hear the tires screaming, don't stop. Don't listen too long. Because the sound isn't just an echo, it's an invitation. And if you let it pull you in, you might not come back out. Highway 84 runs like a stretched ribbon of asphalt across West Texas, unspooling through fields of mesquite and stretches of dry ranch land where barbed wire fences cut the earth into long, straight lines. Out there, the nights are enormous, star-punched, skies pressing down on the cracked road, and the silence gets so thick you can almost taste it. I was driving that way late one September evening, heading back from Lubbock toward Abilene, bone-tired from a long day of work. I remember the radio crackling in and out, AM stations flickering with static until I shut it off and let the hum of the tires keep me company. It was just me, the headlights catching moths in the beam and the dark stretching out forever. You can go miles on 84 without seeing another car at night. That loneliness is part of the road's weight. Around midnight, I caught myself yawning too wide, the kind of tired that makes your eyes water, and I kept blinking at the reflectors on the roadside like they were winking back at me. I rolled the window down for air, the cool desert breeze, cutting across my face, and that's when I saw it. Not in the road ahead, not out in the fields, but in the rearview mirror. A man, sitting calmly in my back seat. At first I thought it was the blur of exhaustion, some reflection in the glass. But I saw the shape of him plain as day, the brim of a hat shadowing his face, shoulders squared like he belonged there. He wasn't leaning forward or clawing at the seat like in a cheap horror flick. He was just sitting, hands on his knees, calm as if he'd been riding with me the whole way. My breath caught and I nearly swerved. Instinct had me whip my head around, and of course the back seat was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, there was nothing but shadows. I told myself it was fatigue, a trick of tired eyes, nothing more. But once you've seen something that clear, it doesn't just wash away. My pulse stayed hard in my throat, every mile an effort to keep steady on the wheel. I turned the radio back on just for noise, the preacher's voice warbling through. Static, but even that felt like it was getting pulled under by silence. I tried not to look at the rear view, but you can't help it. You always look. And when I did, 20 minutes later, he was there again. Same hat, same posture, sitting calm and straight in the back seat. The only difference this time was his head, tilted just slightly toward me like he was watching the side of my face. I didn't look back over my shoulder. Not that time. My knuckles turned white on the wheel and I stared hard at the road, pretending I didn't see him, pretending my eyes weren't tearing up with fear. Then the radio gave a sudden squeal, a shriek of static so loud it made me flinch, and when I did steal a glance back, the seat was empty again. I thought about pulling over, just parking on the shoulder with the hazards on and catching my breath. But the idea of stopping, of being alone in the dead dark with him possibly there, felt worse than pushing through. So I drove. Highway 84 cuts through small towns, most of them asleep by midnight, their gas stations closed, the Dollar General standing in dark parking lots, the occasional Dairy Queen sign flickering. I passed through Post, then Snyder, each town offering a breath of streetlight before the black swallowed me again. Every time the mirror showed him, my stomach dropped into my shoes. He never moved fast, never jumped or lunged, just there, calm, present. Sometimes I'd see the brim of his hat clearly. Once I swore I saw the gleam of his eye, though when I tried to focus it blurred away like heat rising from asphalt. He was never there when I turned, only in the glass. It got to the point where I didn't want to blink, didn't want to let the mirror out of my sight because every reappearance stole another piece of my sanity. By the time I reached Sweetwater, I'd started talking out loud to myself, muttering prayers, curses, anything to keep my mind tethered. I told myself I'd stop at the first gas station with lights on, no matter what. Just get out and breathe human air again. But every station I passed looked closed. Windows black, pumps dark. That's when the headlights showed up behind me. Relief hit first, just knowing another car was out there, a pair of high beams cutting through the night. But then the beams pulled up close, so close the glare filled my rear window. When I blinked against the light, I realized I couldn't see the car. Just the headlights floating too high off the ground, keeping perfect pace. When I glanced into the mirror, the man in the backseat was gone, replaced by that twin glare filling the glass. I craned to look back, but again, nothing was there. The road was empty. By then my heart felt like it was beating in my ears. I pressed harder on the gas, speeding through the dark stretches, watching the reflectors flick by in a frantic rhythm. The headlights vanished the way they'd come, snuffed out like someone flipped a switch, leaving me alone again. But the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore, it was charged, heavy, as if the air itself was waiting. That's when I heard the breathing, not mine. Slow, steady, from behind me. I told myself not to check, not to give in, but I did. In the mirror, he was closer, not sitting back now, leaning forward, brim shadowing his face just behind my shoulder. I don't remember the next few miles. I must have driven half-crazed, eyes fixed ahead, knuckles aching. When the sign for Abilene finally appeared, I thought I might cry. The highway widened, traffic thickened, and the yellow sodium lamps gave the road some measure of safety. I pulled off into a gas station that was thankfully open, lights buzzing, 2 other cars at the pumps. I jumped out before the truck had even fully stopped. My legs were jelly. I kept expecting to hear the door open behind me, boots scuffing on the pavement, but nothing came. Inside, I grabbed a coffee, stood under the fluorescent glow just breathing, watching other normal people buying snacks and cigarettes. No one else seemed to notice anything strange. When I finally got back into the truck, the back seat was empty. I drove the last stretch home with the dome light on, the mirror tilted, up to the ceiling so I wouldn't have to see. But even now, years later, I'll catch myself glancing up when I'm driving alone at night. Sometimes I see nothing. Sometimes just for a second I think I catch the brim of a hat, a shape where no one should be. And every time I look back, the seat is empty, the night stretching behind me like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. I was driving north out of Laredo late one night, long after the city lights had faded in the rear view. The stretch of I-35 between Laredo and Cotulla is nothing but dark scrubland and mesquite trees, the kind of Texas highway where you can go 10 minutes without seeing another pair of headlights. It was early summer, the air still clinging to the heat of the day, my windows cracked to let the desert wind push through. I had the radio low, tuned to some Tejano station out of Nuevo Laredo that was just strong enough to ride the static. I remember thinking about how lonely the road felt. The flatness broken only by the occasional green reflective sign, the glowing eyes of jackrabbits caught in the beam of my high beams, and the faint smell of dust mixing with the hum of my tires. It was around the halfway point, closer to Cotulla than to Laredo when it happened. The song on the radio cut off mid-verse, not to static, not to the empty rush of dead air, but to silence. Utter silence. The hum of the tires was still there. The wind still whispered at the crack of the window, but the radio had gone mute. My first thought was that the station had dropped signal. That happens plenty out there. The desert swallowing weaker stations, whole. But then I noticed the dial light still glowing, the frequency still displayed as though the station was broadcasting just fine. Only no sound came out. I fiddled with the knob, switched stations, but it was all the same. Silence. Even AM, which usually spits static no matter where you are, was flat and dead. That was strange enough to set the hairs rising on my arms. A whole radio band going silent is something I had never experienced before. I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to some quirk of geography or interference, but then I glanced at the odometer and saw something I can't explain. It was right when I passed mile marker 77. The green reflective sign slid by, and a chill went through me though the night was still warm. I drove on, uneasy, the road stretching forward in a straight black ribbon. The silence pressed harder the longer it went on, as though the absence of sound had weight. I turned the volume all the way up, just to test it, and that's when I first heard it. A whisper. Not words at first, just the hushed sound of someone too close to the microphone, a faint intake of breath, the bare scrape of a throat before speech. I froze, my eyes locked on the empty highway because the voice wasn't from outside. It wasn't the wind or something brushing the car. It came from the speakers. I leaned closer, the dial glowing faint green, the volume knob cranked to maximum. The whisper grew stronger the more I strained to hear it. It was several voices at once, layered, speaking in a language I couldn't place. Spanish maybe, or English, or both at once. Words slipping past each other like overlapping radio stations. I caught fragments, syllables that almost made sense before sliding into something else until finally one phrase broke through clear as glass. You're not alone. My hands tightened on the wheel so hard they hurt. I checked the rear view, expecting to see headlights, another driver, something, but the road was empty in both directions. Just me. The whispers rose, voices stacking, some deep, some higher pitched, all pressing against each other. My heart hammered as I passed mile marker 78, my headlights catching the numbers, and right after I did, the radio clicked back to life. Loud. Too loud. The Tejano song blaring mid-chorus as though it had never stopped. The voices vanished. Just like that. I was shaking when I turned the volume down, sweat prickling on my neck. I told myself it had to be some interference, some weird quirk of that stretch of land, but I couldn't get the phrase out of my head. You're not alone. When I hit Cotulla, I pulled into a gas station and asked the clerk if he'd ever lost radio reception out there. He gave me a long look before saying, "Between 77 and 78? Yeah, everybody does. 1 mile dead zone. Radio's cut right out." He shrugged, like it was nothing, like it was as common as hitting a pothole. Some folks say, if you turn it up, you hear things, whispers. I wanted to laugh it off, but the way he said it, like he'd heard it before, made my skin crawl. He didn't elaborate, just rang me up and went back to stacking shelves. I tried not to think about it, but that's the problem with certain things. They get inside you, sit there, waiting. A week later, I was on the same road again, coming back, south this time, and I felt that creeping dread when I saw the mile markers approaching. I told myself I wouldn't touch the radio, that I'd keep it off until I passed mile 78. But as the sign came into view, I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out and turned the knob. Silence again. This time the whispers began immediately. louder, clearer. Dozens of voices hissing, overlapping, some laughing faintly, others crying, all too human. My scalp prickled with cold sweat. Then, cutting through them all, one voice, a woman's, sharp and close. "Don't look." I gripped the wheel so tight my arms shook, my eyes glued to the road. The voice came again, more urgent. "Don't look in the mirror," which of course meant I did. For a split second, the back seat wasn't empty. There was a man sitting there, his face pale, his eyes black pits, his mouth stretched wide in a grin too large for his face. He was leaning forward as though about to climb over the seat. I swerved, nearly losing control, and when I looked again, the seat was empty. The voices had cut out, the radio blaring music as though nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've asked around. Truckers know about it. They call it Dead Radio Mile. Some refuse to drive that stretch at night. Others claim if you keep listening long enough, the voices say your name, or worse, you hear the voice of someone you know, someone who isn't alive anymore. There are stories about wrecks, drivers found dead on the shoulder with their radios still on. No sign of collision. No reason their hearts should have stopped. I don't know what lives in that mile of Texas highway, or why it cuts through the radio waves the way it does. But I know one thing. If you ever drive I-35 between Laredo and Cotulla, and you see mile marker 77 glowing in your headlights, do yourself a favor. Don't touch the dial, because the silence isn't empty. And if you listen close enough, it listens back. The desert out west has a silence to it that's different from anywhere else. It's not like the soft hush of pine woods or the distant hum of a city sleeping. Out there on FM 170, what they call the river road between Lajitas and Presidio, the silence is so heavy it presses down on you. Makes you notice every small sound your car makes, every rattle of the dashboard, every cough of wind that sneaks in through the cracked seal of your window. The Rio Grande snakes alongside you for miles, glittering silver under the moon when it feels like the only other living thing left awake. I had been driving that road late one July night, tired and wired in equal measure, my headlights carving a tunnel through the dark when I saw him. He looked too young to be out there alone. Thin, maybe 17, standing on the shoulder in a faded denim jacket and jeans that were scuffed white at the knees. His hair was dark and messy, his thumb sticking out with that old-fashioned hitchhiker's stance, though I swear I didn't see him until I was practically on top of him. One moment the road was empty, the next he was there, caught in the high beams like a deer. Instinct made me ease off the gas, and before I could talk myself out of it, I was pulling onto the gravel. Shoulder. Dust swirled up around my headlights. He didn't move until I rolled down the window. "Where you headed?" I asked. My voice cracked from disuse. I hadn't spoken in hours. The boy leaned down, resting an elbow on the window frame, and his eyes struck me first. Wide, brown, too calm for someone stranded in the desert at midnight. He smelled faintly of dust and old leather, and his voice when he spoke was flat, almost careful. "Where are you going?" The way he asked it unsettled me. I half expected him to climb in without waiting for an answer, but he just stood there, waiting, the wind lifting the hem of his jacket. I told him I was headed east toward Marfa. As soon as the words left my mouth, he was gone. Not walked away, not ducked out of sight. Gone. The passenger side was empty, the road behind me bare under the moonlight. My headlights stretched out, over gravel and scrub brush, nothing moving, nothing there. The dust I'd kicked up was still hanging in the beams, but there was no sign of him. My heart hammered and I sat frozen, gripping the wheel, staring into that emptiness until the silence grew unbearable. Finally, I threw the car into gear and drove off, faster than before, refusing to glance in the rearview mirror. For miles, I told myself I was tired, that I had imagined him. The desert does things to people, especially at night, especially when the heat of the day lingers in the asphalt and the horizon ripples with mirages even after dark. But I knew what I had seen. I knew how close he'd been, the details of his face sharp enough to etch themselves into memory, the denim jacket, the way his thumb had been out, the strange calm in his voice, and the way he vanished like he'd never been. By the time I reached Presidio, my hands were trembling on the wheel. I stopped at a gas station that looked half-shuttered, the kind where the fluorescent lights hum and flicker and the clerk barely looks up from his newspaper. I grabbed a cup of burnt coffee and tried to steady myself. The clerk was an older, Mexican man, sun-browned and heavy-set with a silver cross hanging from his neck. When I mentioned the hitchhiker, his eyes shifted. He set down his paper slowly. "Denim jacket?" he asked. His English was accented but clear. I nodded. "He asked you where you go?" Again I nodded. His face darkened, and he muttered something in Spanish, too low for me to catch. "What is it?" I pressed. He looked at me then, really looked, like he was measuring something in me. "You don't stop for him again. You see him, you keep driving. That road, it'd take many people. He one of them." I wanted to ask more, but his expression, closed like a door. He waved me off and went back to his paper, and I drove away with my questions gnawing at me. Over the years, I've heard versions of the story whispered in bars, at gas stations, from truckers who drive the river road at night. Some say he was a boy from Presidio who disappeared hitchhiking home from school decades ago. Others say he's older, something born from the desert itself, a trick of the land that punishes anyone foolish enough to stop. They all agree on the same thing, though. He appears suddenly, calm as ever, and if you answer him, he vanishes. A few say worse things happen if you don't. A trucker swore he kept driving once, ignored the boy, and later found handprints pressed into the dust on his back window when he stopped in Alpine. Blue handprints like the skin had no blood left in it. I can't say for sure what I saw that night, but I know I stopped. I know I answered. And sometimes when I drive alone, I think about that calm voice asking me where I'm headed. I hear it in the hum of my tires, in the stretch of silence between radio stations. I never see him in the road again, but I feel like he knows where I'm going, like he's always just a step ahead waiting for me to catch up. And the worst part is, I think one day I will. Corpus Christi in the summer carries its own heavy kind of silence after midnight. The air holds the warmth of the day even as the Gulf wind brushes through the mesquite and the coastal grasslands, and the hum of insects never really stops. That night, I pulled into the rest stop off Highway 77 with my wife and our daughter, the tires crunching over the gravel as we slowed past the yellow sodium lights. The building squatted low and square against the flat stretch of land, its tiled walls, streaked from years of salt and wind, its restrooms glowing faintly beneath the buzzing lights. We'd been driving since Houston and I was dead tired, but the little one had been restless in the back seat, whining, and my wife suggested we stop so she could use the restroom and settle down. The lot wasn't empty, which surprised me for the hour. There were 3 other vehicles parked, an 18-wheeler idling with its marker lights glowing dull red, a white sedan with fogged windows, and a minivan parked way off to the side. I saw no movement though, no one sitting behind a wheel or stretching their legs, just the constant hum of cicadas and the faint tick of our engine as I cut it off. My wife unbuckled our daughter and they headed toward the women's side while I leaned against the car, lighting a cigarette I'd promised to quit. The smoke curled upward, bitter and sharp in my mouth, mixing with the damp sea smell that drifted inland. I remember glancing at my watch, 12:18 a.m. The lot was so still it pressed against the ears, and then, faint but clear, I heard a knock. 3 quick raps, wood against wood. It came from the direction of the restrooms. I thought maybe someone was in a stall tapping, or maybe a janitor with a mop bucket, but it didn't sound like that. It was deliberate, like knuckles against a door. A moment passed, then it came again. I flicked my cigarette, listening. That was when I noticed the trucker had killed his engine. The glow of his cab was dark, the red lights of the trailer quiet, like the whole rig had gone cold without me noticing. The sedan, too. No movement, no music, just a solid husk under the light. The knocking came again, sharper this time. My wife stepped out then, our girl on her hip, and I asked her if she heard it. She frowned, shook her head, but then she looked back toward the women's restroom door and I saw her eyes narrow. "It came from there," she said quietly. We waited. the three of us standing in the lot. Then it came again, from the men's side this time. 3 hard knocks, right against the metal door. My daughter whimpered, hiding her face in her mother's shirt. I felt stupid, but I walked over. The men's door was a dull brown, chipped paint, and a push bar scratched to silver. I put my hand against it. The metal was damp with the coastal air. For a long second, I waited. Nothing. And then the knocking came again, this time from the other side of the door I was touching. Clear, distinct, rapid, like a small fist hammering. I jerked back. My wife hissed at me not to open it. But something in me, the same mix of curiosity and unease that pulls you toward the sound in the dark, made me push the bar. The door swung open with a squeal. No one was there, just the restroom with its cracked tiles, the smell of ammonia, the flicker of a single fluorescent tube buzzing above the sinks. My breath was loud in my ears. I stepped inside, looking quickly into the stalls. Empty. I walked the length of it, even checked the mop closet. Nothing. When I stepped back out, into the night, the sound of the insects hit me again like static. My wife was staring at the ground. At first, I didn't see what she meant. Then my stomach went cold. Wet footprints. Small ones. Bare feet, child-sized, stamped in dark patches against the concrete right outside the door. They led away into the grass, each one sharp and defined as if the boy had just stepped from a shower. The trail continued into the field, where the mesquite and scrub grass swallowed them. My daughter whimpered again and clutched her mother tight. I wanted to call out to see if maybe someone's kid had wandered off. But the footprints ended just 20 yards out, vanishing into dry dirt, as if the boy had evaporated. We didn't stay long after that. My wife bundled our daughter into the car and I lit another cigarette with shaking hands before climbing in. The other vehicles in the lot hadn't moved, hadn't so much as flickered. But as we pulled out, I glanced in, the rearview mirror. The restroom door was still swinging gently on its hinges, back and forth like someone had just stepped through again. We drove on in silence for miles. The highway stretched black and endless before us. I didn't say anything more because the longer I thought about those prints, the clearer I saw something I hadn't at first. They weren't shaped quite right. The toes were too long, the arch too high, the heel too narrow, like the impression of a foot that had been pressed and stretched in water too long. And when I replayed the sound in my head, that knocking, it didn't sound like knuckles after all. It was hollow, almost like the rattle of bone against metal. I haven't stopped at a rest stop since. Not after midnight, not near Corpus Christi. And when my daughter wakes in the night now, crying, she sometimes says she heard knocking on her bedroom door. We never find anyone there, but once I saw the faint outline of damp little prints on the carpet leading back toward her window. US 90 runs like a tight wire across that part of Texas, and at night it feels like you're walking it without a net. There's a comfort to it if you've done it enough times. I had. Deliveries took me from San Antonio out west to Del Rio twice a week. A van full of copier, toner, and fusers ratcheted down behind me, the boxes bumping in their straps whenever the pavement settled and rose with the old heat. In summer, the air holds on to the day like a grudge. You crack the windows, and the air you get isn't cooler so much as different, a mesquite and dust smell that proves the world outside the windshield still exists. I made that run so often I knew the radio dead zones by mile marker. Knew where DPS liked to tuck a cruiser in the median grass. Knew which gas stations on the return trip stayed open late enough to keep you from drinking coffee that tastes like burnt pennies. Familiarity is its own lullaby. That's how it sneaks up on you when the familiar bends just a few degrees off true. The first time I heard them, I was coming east out of Del Rio with the last of the heat still bleeding off the asphalt. It was close to 10. I had one of those plastic diner mugs tucked in the cup holder, lukewarm by then, and a bag of sunflower seeds sitting open on the passenger seat. The road behind was empty each time I checked, a shine of tar and the suggestion of distant red from a semi that had gone past me a half hour earlier. I had the radio settled on an AM station out of San Antonio, that likes to talk about high school football and county fairs after sunset. The voice fuzzed in and out like it was breathing. I thumbed the volume down to let the night wrap around the van. That was when the sound came crawling up the back of my neck, deep enough that it felt like it had started in my ribs rather than in my ears. It was engines. Not one, not two, but a chorus of them. A single note made out of many, all old, all iron. There's a particular way an old straight-six coughs when it's under load, throatier than modern gas engines, more stubborn than diesel. You learn that if you keep your hands in and around machines long enough. These sounded like that, throats full of something heavy. I looked in the rear view by reflex. The highway behind me was as black as a pond. The sound swelled anyway. Without deciding to, I eased my foot off the gas. My van's speedometer needle drooped 5 miles per hour, then 10. The sound kept pace. It felt like the noise was latching onto the skin between my shoulder blades. It climbed until the metal of the van picked it up and the coins in the ashtray rattled a little. Headlights should have been there. That's the rule of the road. You hear a thing, then you see the thing. You fit it into one of the slots you already have for trucks, pickups, farm equipment. When it doesn't go into any of the slots, your hands get damp on the wheel. I shifted my eyes from the mirror to the side glass. Nothing but my own reflection and the streaked weave of the bar. Ditch. Then the light showed itself. Not modern bright white, not the cold LED some folks like to slap on their lifted trucks. This was low and yellow like dim lamps in old film. 1 pair, then 3, then a string of them, skimming the pavement so low they looked like they were kissing the surface, keeping formation as perfect as a ruler's edge. People collect things in this state. You can find a guy who has 10 decommissioned patrol cars and keeps them running like the day they left the lot. You can find a guy who has 10 of the same shovel hanging on his barn wall because his daddy swore by that brand and he can't help it. So I told myself there were men out here who kept old army trucks in convoy shape and drove them at night for the joy of it. It wasn't the strangest lie I had ever asked myself to swallow. They held steady behind me a long time without gaining, the sound building and holding and making the coffee in my stomach taste metallic. When the overpass showed itself, a county road crossing the highway on concrete legs 30 feet ahead, I didn't put anything together. Why would I? I drove under it and the night closed in for a blink. The sound cut in that blink. I came out the other side and my rear view showed me nothing but the red reflection of my own taillights. The convoy was gone. The smell remained. Burned. Fuel has its own language. Cold diesel smells one way, hot diesel another, and burned wrong is something else entirely. What came in through the cracked windows and soaked into the seats smelled like fuel driven past its point. Like the last sharp curl of smoke that comes off a campfire when you douse it with too little water. Like the cling of a garage rag that's wiped too many crankcases and never seen soap. I drove the rest of the way to San Antonio with that smell sitting next to me, like a passenger who doesn't talk. I was still smelling it when I put the van in my driveway a little after midnight and walked across the grass to my front door. My ex had left an iron star on the siding that she liked. When the porch light hit it that night, it threw a dull shadow that looked like something burned into wood long ago. I don't know why that bothered me. I slept poorly. I dreamed nothing that I remember beyond waking twice with the taste of rubber in my mouth. Morning peels back the silly from night things. I told myself what you'd tell yourself. It was an odd trick of sound down in a low spot. It was my own engine resonating in some way I hadn't noticed before. It was kids with vintage trucks cutting through under the overpass. I told a man, named Carlos, who runs a shop I deliver to on Fredericksburg Road. He grew up in Eagle Pass, knows that country better than I do, and he's not one to be impressed by talk. He listened with his hands on the edge of a carton and said, without smiling, that I should keep my window rolled up if I ever caught the smell again. He said something about how things sometimes ask to be invited. I laughed because laughing clears the air, and he did not laugh with me. The next time I saw the lights, I had company. A woman named Hannah had come out with me to Del Rio to visit her sister and cadge a ride back. We were 2 months into something undefined, simple in the way things can be when your pronouns and needs line up and you both like old movies and slow diners, where the waitress calls you baby because she calls everybody baby. She dozed with her head against the crook where the seatbelt meets the pillar. Smell of strawberry shampoo cutting through the smell the van seemed to have taken in the way a house keeps smoke long after a tenant quits. I spotted the glow of them at the far edge of the mirror a mile before they made sound. They were there as quietly as stars at first, and then the sound lifted itself out of the dark, like something rolling over in deep water. I didn't tell Hannah. Not then. I only eased off the gas. The lights held formation, not gaining or dropping, not stuttering like headlights do when the road undulates. It was like they were on wire, and the wire bent because I bent. The overpass grew over us. It was the same one. I could tell by the big water stain on the third panel from the right. There is a way you get to know a stretch of concrete that has seen too much sun. We hit the shadow and came out into moonlight, and the night was empty again. The smell came in, and Hannah opened her eyes and frowned and said she felt sick. And then she folded her arms against her stomach like somebody in a waiting room trying to hold still. We rode a mile in that, and it passed off her. She asked me if a truck had blown by, and I said no. I said the road had dipped. She looked out at the black. I watched the way she watched and felt like a man who has allowed a stranger onto his property. It would have been fine to let it be a story you tell once in a while. Nudge a friend and say, you know what I saw, and then see if he says he's seen it too, just to be a good friend. It didn't feel like that. It felt like the road had learned my name. 2 nights after Hannah and I made that ride, I took the van through a wash bay because the rig had a thin patina like soot on the rear door and bumper, a granular grit that didn't smear like dirt so much as transfer. I paid to have the undercarriage blasted and watched a sheet of black water crawl away across the concrete and disappear into the drain. I walked around the back and put my fingers to the metal and sniffed them, and felt stupid for what I wanted to find. My fingers didn't smell like anything. I went home and slept, and in the morning the van smelled again, faint but sincere, the way a room smells like a candle long after the wick is cold. I left the driver's door open for half an hour, and my neighbor's cat jumped in and sat on the seat and looked at me with that particular disapproval cats do. Even the cat got out of the van quick, tail twitching like it had brushed a live wire. I asked around more than I let on. It turns out grown men still share ghost stories. They do it in the way men share most things. They keep the soft edges tucked in. A trucker at a Stripes near Hondo with gray sweat dark under his cap said he'd heard of it. He called it the Vanishing Convoy without a trace of music in his voice and told me it ran between Uvalde and Sabinal, sometimes as far as Castroville. He told me a DPS trooper had once tried to follow them only to find himself driving into blank road like a screen with the picture turned off. The trooper told his supervisor he'd ridden his brakes for a full minute, and they hadn't caught. The supervisor told him to take a week off and didn't write any of it down. The trucker said most of the time they show themselves on clear nights like they don't like weather. He said the smell comes if you're meant to have it. He said that last part like he didn't want to have said it. The part where I made a decision came slow and then fast. There are people who can turn their back to a thing, and there are people who find themselves looking for it once they've seen it. The way you can't help putting your tongue to the place where a tooth was. The next Friday I ran the deliveries and timed it so that I'd hit that same stretch of US 90 after 10. I told myself it was for the sake of efficiency. If I admit what I was hoping, you'll think worse of me, or you'll think the same, depending on whether you've ever let the dark talk you into anything. I hummed east with the windows cracked and the radio quiet and every light on the dash steady as if reassuring me that only ordinary things were happening. Mile markers rolled up and fell behind. The soft green of the sign for the county road with the water tower floated in the van's beams and drifted past. I dug a seed out of the bag and split it and spit the shell into a paper cup, and it stuck to my lip because my mouth had gone dry. They came out of the black like they'd been waiting just beyond the edge where my taillights died. No sweep as they caught up, no change in the pitch of their noise. They were simply there. I found my blinker ticking slow and soft without remembering to have put it on. I pulled onto the shoulder and set my hazards going, bright square pulses punching holes in the dark. The convoy took that for a signal if they could take anything at all. They stayed their exact distance. They did not go around. The overpass wasn't far. I looked at my hands where they held the wheel and saw little threads of black at my cuticles, the kind you get from newsprint. I wiped my palms on my jeans and they left nothing there. For half a minute, the engines were the whole world. I put the van back into gear and eased forward, letting the cable from my seatbelt spool out with a sound like a small zipper. When the concrete closed over the cab, I rolled the windows up. I held my breath to listen the way you do, tightening. Everything in your chest like that helps your ears. I wanted to keep the smell out, as if the smell were a thing that could gnaw its way into you like a nest of moths if you let it. We came out into open sky and I took a breath and choked because the smell was in the van anyway. Ripe and thick and complicated, a mixture of rubber and oil and something sweet like syrup that had been boiled too long. I pulled onto the gravel, right past the overpass, and killed the engine and stepped down into heat that had been saved up in the earth all day. I stood there with the tick-tick of hot metal cooling under me and the buzzing of invisible insects somewhere in the bar ditch. And the night made its case. There was nothing behind me. Even the highway felt like a dead thing. The smell started to thin the way fog thins, and then it didn't. Then it seemed to hesitate. Then it rose back up full like it had been deciding whether to leave me alone, and had changed its mind. I walked back toward the shadow of the overpass because people do stupid things when they're given an empty stage. The concrete belly overhead made the space under it a room. You could see where the years had drawn, a soot stripe along the beams. A plastic bag stirred in the weeds and whispered against dry grass. I ran my fingers along the wall and my fingertips came back as clean as if the concrete were new. The throbbing I felt in my bones wasn't there anymore, but its memory was. A light came down the county road and crossed the bridge, and I stood very still with my hand on the wall and watched the rectangle of headlight drift across the dirt on the far side like a blank card. The light was white, modern, the kind that makes all colors look honest. Then it was gone, and a car door closed up there and somebody walked, heels clicking. They didn't pause to look down at the highway where I stood. If they had, I might have had to explain myself, and how would I have done it? After that night, it didn't matter if I wanted in or not. The convoy got in me. It bled into other pieces of life. On the lot behind the strip mall where my little warehouse sits, a smear of something like soot developed along the cinder block where I leaned the back door open with my foot when the hinges stuck. It wasn't oil from my hand. It didn't wipe. You could take a putty knife to it and you'd come away with dust and still see a shadow there like a tattoo under skin. The radio in the van found a channel I had never tuned, voices with clipped cadence saying numerals and names that had the weight of phonetic alphabet behind them. And when I tried to record it on my phone, I got only the hum and rush and pop of vacuum. Hannah told me my clothes smelled wrong after my runs and then caught herself and apologized for having said wrong. A week later, she said we should see each other less for a while. I told her I understood and believed myself. I didn't tell her I had been sitting in the driveway at midnight with the van idling, listening, and would have kept sitting there until the sun came up if a neighbor 2 houses over hadn't flicked on his kitchen light and stood in his white undershirt drinking a glass of water and looking out at nothing like he'd been called to witness something that hadn't happened. If I could point to where I stopped being reasonable about it, it would be a Tuesday afternoon in a diner near Sabanal where the waitress did not call me baby. In that way, the place felt more honest. A man on the stool to my left had the kind of sunburned people only get if they work outside every day, and the kind of ignored wedding ring a man wears when he's lost the habit of fiddling with it. He watched me push a chopped steak around my plate and said, conversational as a neighbor asking if you ever figured out why your lawn is yellow in patches, that he had seen them once when he was a boy. He said his daddy had taken him out to spotlight jackrabbits, and his daddy had parked on the shoulder to let a pair of rigs run past, and then the rigs had stepped out of the world. He described the smell. He said his daddy had slapped him on the chest with the back of his hand without looking at him and said, "Keep your mouth closed." I asked him why, and he said his daddy had told him that breath is also a door. He said it like he worried he had said too much but could not take it back. I started pulling over at different overpasses. They exist with a sameness that makes you understand what soldiers mean when they talk about the comfort of uniformity. Each concrete belly has its stains and chalk scrawls and bird nest in a corner, and yet each feels like the same room. The trucks did not show for me every time, which saved me from the lie that I could force them to move according to my schedule. When they did take shape, it was as if they had been behind me from the minute I clicked the seatbelt, as if they had issued out of the mirror itself. I began to notice small differences. One time I saw what I took to be a canvas cover on the back of the lead truck ripple like a sail when wind touches it sideways. Another time I thought I saw a figure solid in the passenger seat of the third truck, a lump of shoulders and a hat brim. I couldn't hold those details with my eyes long enough to swear. The sounds stayed stubbornly consistent. That heavy chorus. That metallic breath. The smell always came last, like an afterthought, like something remembered as you set your key on the kitchen counter. I wanted to be rid of it in the efficient way you want to be rid of a song stuck in your head. I decided that the only way out was through. If I'm honest, some sour part of me also liked the idea that there was a thing in the world, and I was the one who had decided to go and meet it halfway. I bought a cheap dash camera from a place that sells you every small piece of electronics you don't need. I brought extra batteries. I taped my phone to the headliner pointing backward because the dash camera didn't. I told myself that proof would turn the shape of it into a puzzle instead of a visitation. I waited until I knew I could hit that stretch of highway on the full edge of night. I drove at the exact speed I had been driving before on purpose, and I ate seeds in the same rhythm, and I set the radio to the same volume and station, as if I could conjure them like a recipe. When they came the way thunder rolls, up a draw. The cameras hummed their dumb machine hum, self-important, and the LEDs on them blinked red in a pattern like the hazard lights we recognize with something soft in us. I held the van in the center of the lane and pictured how I would tell the story of the footage to Carlos at the shop, and to the trucker, and maybe even to Hannah, if I could pretend the smell had always been in my imagination. The overpass nodded its gray head down at me, and I went into the shadow and came out, and the lights were gone, and the smell sat down on my chest, and the cameras had recorded exactly 60 seconds of nothing but me and the thumb of my hand tapping out a nervous little march on the wheel. The footage before and after existed. The minute of world where the lights should have glowed like low moons did not. I didn't tell Carlos. I didn't tell anyone. I put the camera in a drawer and put my hand on it, and the plastic was warm like something alive in there, warm in a way the drawer should not have been. The next part came wrong. I was eastbound again, and a summer storm had roped itself over the hills north of the road and was flicking tongues of lightning out at the mesquite, like it wanted to taste it. The highway ran dry. The smell of the dirt lifting was good and clean and reminding. The radios were debating football even though the season hadn't started. I was alone in the van except for the boxes. I had the feeling you get when you know you're going to do something before you do it, and the knowing itself is the step over the threshold. I had no plan to follow them. I had no strap to hook to a bumper or magnet to slap on steel. The idea of it was so foolish I had not allowed it language in my head. You already know what I did. When the lights took shape at the edge of the mirror, I nudged the van into the left lane and then eased onto the shoulder of the median, a thin tongue of concrete between the two directions there. I brought the speed down to match the speed of that wrong chorus exactly, measured by ear and bone. For one breath, I saw the lights tremble and change texture like heat over a road, the way that makes a thing seem to shift inside itself. I kept the speed matched. The overpass approached. We went into the shadow together. There was no road in the shadow. There was no van. There was nothing. Not like a blank or a solid black, but like the space where a word you know well would go, and you forget it and your mouth makes the shape anyway. Then I came out and there was road and my hands on the wheel, and the radio spitting static like poured salt, and the van too slow, and the hazard lights thudding because I had tapped the switch while I was somewhere there was no switch. For the length of a heartbeat, the trucks were not gone. They were in front of me so close their brake lights were red slits at the lower edge of the world, and the flat tops of their beds were black shapes against a sky that did not look like our sky. The smell didn't sit with me then. It invaded. It forced its way in like water under a door you forgot to sand the bottom of. It was oil and cooked rubber and something that had once been animal, and something that had once been sweet. My eyes watered, and I drove blind for a second, and when I wiped the tears away with the back of my left wrist, I saw black on the skin like I had swiped it across a stove grate. I could swear I felt heat on the insides of my wrists like the ghost of handcuffs. In the instant before the trucks took their exit into the empty air, I thought I saw men in the bed sitting on benches with their helmets on and their mouths set like men who have told jokes. and are not in the mood anymore to hear them. That should have been enough for a life. It wasn't even the worst of it. You can live a long time without thinking how many overpasses your city has, because they're just part of the fact of roads. Whatever I had done by choosing to match the speed and go under with them had taught the convoy something about me or me about them or the world about both. The smell began to arrive on overpasses that were not theirs. Once, leaving Loop 410 to catch I-10 early in the morning, after a rain had polished everything, I got that familiar sweet burn thread in the air as I slipped under the concrete, and I gripped the wheel and my stomach clenched and the van juddered once like a hand had flicked the frame. The radio threw numbers at me and I turned it off, and then there was a thin voice not through the speakers but in the plastic of the dash, like sound lives in material and can be coaxed out by certain notes the way a glass can be coaxed into singing. I sat through that and came out into daylight and told myself I was tired and should sleep more, and then the van's glove box scissored open on its own, and something slid out and hit my knee and fell to the floor. It was a dog tag on a ball, chain, blackened and jittery on the edges like it had been chewed. The embossed letters were hard to make out. I could see a name and a blood type, and a number that did not resemble a number we use now. I pushed the glove box closed hard enough to make the latch spit, because the movement of the tag on my shin had felt like another thing touching me, and that had done something sour in my head. I put the dog tag in the junk drawer in my kitchen, because that is where Americans place artifacts we are not prepared to frame. I covered it with a stack of expired coupons and an old key and a deck of cards. I walked away from the drawer and then back and put a folded paper towel under the pile because, in the time it took me to get to the sink, I had decided that I did not want the thing touching my other things. That night I thought I heard the chain click against the metal as if something had shifted in the dark. The next morning my fingers found a smear on the drawer pull like soot, and I scrubbed it with a sponge and changed the sponge out afterward because of a dread that does not have a logic. I can defend. This is the place in the telling where the cards the story has stacked slide and spread, and you see the picture they make when they are not hiding their faces. I was in Uvalde again because my work made me go there. The air had been holding heat for days like a secret you don't want to share. I had 3 stops and then I was free to run home. I finished the third, just as the sun made the sky go that fish belly color that tells you the day has a little life left in it. I didn't want to run that highway again at night, and so of course I did. I didn't go looking for the overpass, I let the road carry me to it. When the lights hummed themselves into being, I did not feel frightened. I felt like the world had put me on a track. The difference that night was that there was a cruiser sitting in the median, DPS, bold as brass, angled to make his presence known. As I drew parallel with him, his headlights popped alive and he slid out and tucked in behind me without hitting the bar lights. The convoy's lights sat behind him. For a second I entertained the ordinary hope that he'd see the wrongness, and he'd handle it because a uniform promises to carry certain burdens for you. The hope died slow, the way the taste of medicine lingers. He hit his blues right before the overpass, a lick of red and blue across the pillar, and I pulled into the shoulder. He took his time behind me before he got out, the way they do to let you think. He came up on my passenger side and I rolled the window down, and the smell came in with him like he brought it, like he wore it in the cloth of his uniform. He took his hat off the pinch of his forehead and he had that creased face men get when they have seen every variety of sadness, and each has left its own line. He asked me for the usual. I gave it to him. He didn't take it with eyes that looked at it. He kept glancing at his mirror. He said my brake light on the left was dim. He said it exactly like a man telling another man that his fly was down. I said I'd fix it. I said, "Sir, do you see them?" He kept his face so still I admired the control of it. He said it was a quiet night. He didn't tell me to step out. He handed me my things and tapped the edge of the window with the back of his hand and told me to have a good evening. He had not meant me to do anything but nod. I put the van in gear. The overpass took us and gave us back, and the smell swelled, until both of us turned our heads the same way at the same time, like 2 dogs hearing a noise inside a wall. He was behind me and then he wasn't. The convoy wasn't then either. I eased to a stop and my hazard lights ticked like a patient heartbeat. For a long block of time, the only sound was the idling of my own engine and the insect static of the radio dying and living and dying again. When at last I looked back up, there was nothing behind me but the white line, and a piece of a shredded truck tire like a snake that had decided to lie down. I stayed put until a car whistled by me and somebody leaned on a horn, and the horn's human anger made me feel part of the world again. I drove until I found the next exit and pulled over and threw up in the lot of a closed farm supply store beneath a billboard with a smiling woman on it who wanted to sell me tires. I wiped my mouth on a receipt and went home and took the dog tag out of the drawer and put it on the kitchen counter and said out loud, enough. Enough did not stick. There are stories in small towns if you're gentle when you ask. Men at the wash rack at the volunteer fire station will give you the edges if you lean on the rail and don't try to direct it. In Uvalde, a man told me, while he took his time, uncoiling a hose, that there had been a fuel fire once long before he was born. Some guard unit running exercises that had gone wrong near the bridge from town. He said his uncle claimed that the trucks had kept trying to drive away even while they burned, because that's what they had been told to do, and that sometimes orders stake themselves in the ground deeper than sense. He said his uncle liked to talk. He said his uncle liked to drink. He said, take it how you want. When he lowered the hose, water arced into the sun and broke into 1,000 small lights and then fell back into one water again. He aimed the stream at the mud at his boots and said that the smell some folks talk about is the same, once you've smelled it once, patient and greedy, and that's how you know it's not your mind arranging things to suit itself. The last time I let them take me happened in the city, and that's the part that still feels like a cold hand. I was on 90 nearer to town where the highway lifts itself into over and under and exits multiply like questions. It was later than I wanted it to be. I had the sense when I slid under the first concrete belly that there were more of them ahead. In a run, a ladder of shadows, and I felt the idea rise that if the convoy wanted me, it had a lot of rungs to use. The radio had given up pretending to be radio. It sat like a dog in the seat and breathed and sometimes coughed. The lights found me without the courtesy of easing themselves up. For the first time, they appeared both in the mirror and in the forward glass, low in the lane ahead, as if they had slipped around me while I'd blinked. The smell pressed up under my tongue like a taste. There wasn't a choice in the way people mean when they tell you that you always have a choice. There was the van, and me inside, and the lanes and the concrete making a tunnel of each space, and the red eyes at the rear of the trucks ahead, and the old man yellow eyes of the trucks behind, and the absolute knowledge that the road I'd traveled for years had turned into something else while pretending not to. I put the van in the exact middle of the lane. The wheel tugged once like a hand on your sleeve at church. The rungs of shadow came in sequence, the way a train ticks. Over the joints it has always ticked over, and the world folded itself neatly at each dark slice and unfolded itself on the other side with the smallest of sighs. The smell reached a saturation point that made my nose want to stop being a nose. The red slits ahead grew no nearer. The yellow behind did not recede. My speedometer needle gently settled in a place where it had never wanted to sit before and held there as if something steady had decided for us all. The radio whispered letters. I can write them here, but they will look common, and in your mind they will sound like information, and that is not how they sounded. They sounded like orders given by someone who did not care if you obeyed but knew you would. I thought of the dog tag in the drawer, and I thought of Hannah's strawberry shampoo, and I thought of the man in the diner whose father had told him to keep his mouth closed, and I thought of the trooper, and the way his face had not changed when I asked him if he saw them. The concrete went away again for an instant, and in that absence that is not an absence, I had the cleanest thought I had had in months. I thought, this is where they go. I do not mean I saw a place like a map with a label on it that tells you what it is. I mean I felt the direction the way a needle feels north. And the direction was not a place on our road, but a notch in the skin between two lanes of the same heart. When we came back into our world, the smell dropped away. Not like a curtain, but like a song ended at the exact moment it should, the way a band can stop and leave silence that is perfect. The red slits ahead blinked once and were gone. The yellow behind winked out. The van coasted. The sound of my own breath entered the cabin like a stranger. I got off the highway. I took a long way home through neighborhoods that had names like, "You give to things you hope will be gentle." I stopped at a light and a kid on a scooter rolled up and glanced at me and then glanced away, because the thing in my face was not a thing a kid should have to see on a Tuesday. I sat in my driveway with the van off and the night touching the pecan leaves, and I listened. There is a residue to attention. Once you have paid it in a certain direction, the change in you doesn't return for a while. The smell was gone, and that felt wrong. I went inside and I opened the junk drawer, and the dog tag was not on top of the paper towel. I moved the coupons aside and the deck of cards and the old key and the screwdriver that fits nothing anymore. The tag lay flat against the wood, the chain coiled neat, the blackness on its edges less than it had been. I touched it with the pad of one finger, and for a moment felt a warmth there, the exact temperature a wrist gives off when the owner has just set his hand on your forearm to make a point. I put it back and closed the drawer and washed my hands and sat at the table and closed my eyes and saw the line of red slits at the edge of a sky I could not describe with the words we use for color. You can choose not to take a certain road. I did for a while. I rerouted around every overpass I could, and in Texas that is like asking water not to run downhill. I taught myself the tree-lined back streets through Castroville and the slow drags through small towns that throw speed, traps like nets. I told my clients I'd be slower. I lived slower. For a handful of weeks the smell did not present itself and the radio spoke ordinary nonsense, and I collected the small joys you can if you are methodical, the way a man can collect screws in a jar and feel he has accomplished something by the end of the afternoon. Then one night at 2 a.m. I woke from sleep because the whole house had taken on the faintest suggestion of burned sugar, not strong enough to alarm. Strong enough to bring me standing in socks in the kitchen with both hands flat on the counter, the way you hold yourself steady on a ship because you don't trust your legs. I opened the drawer. The tag was warm to the touch. The smell was a little stronger and then less stronger and then less like breath. In the glass of the microwave I could see the kitchen and my shape and a small suggestion of something in the door behind me that looked like it wanted to be light. I do not have a moral to hand you. If you wanted one, you should have looked elsewhere, long ago. I can tell you that on clear nights when I am on US 90, I keep my windows rolled up even if the heat presses down like a palm. I can tell you that I do not stop beneath overpasses anymore. That is as close to wisdom as I have. I can tell you that more than once I've seen the low yellow lights stacked in the mirror at a steady distance, and I have watched them follow me for miles and then go away in a blink in the shadow with a smell that comes and sits beside you like a friend you don't like to disappoint. I can tell you that in San Antonio, there are overpasses built in the last 10 years, and we think new things are safe from old stories, and that belief is a luxury you only hold until whatever rides behind you decides to take a different road, for variety. A month ago, on a small errand at noon in good American daylight, I passed under a short overpass on a frontage road, and the van's radio lost its mind, and the dog tag sang against the keys in the kitchen drawer I had not opened, and for a second the shadow was deep enough that headlights could have glowed and been correct. There were no headlights in that shadow. There was the smell. It touched me light as a hand on a shoulder in a crowd. When I came out into sun again, there was a blot on my forearm the size and shape of a thumbprint, ash gray. I scrubbed it, hard enough that the skin went red and thin and it did not lift. It stayed a week and then it left enough that you'd call it gone if you wanted to be done with it. I have not looked close lately to see if there's any trace left, and that is a decision I recommend. I would like to leave you with the idea that I am in charge of whether I see them again, that I can decide how I will be with the world, and the world will answer in kind. I can't do that for you. I can say that in the little hours, the time of night when you can hear the power lines if you stand under them, I sometimes wake to the sound of engines not in my house and not in the street, but inside the parts of me that carry a tune whether I want them to or not. It's heavy and patient, and it does not harm me. It simply waits there in its slot until the light from the window tells me that another day is on the other side of the glass if I'll go meet it. When I take the van out and settle my hands on the wheel, and the highway finds itself under me, again, and the rows of mesquite go past in their old regularity, the parts of the world that have not changed are enough to make a man feel brave. Then the concrete belly of an overpass darkens the windshield for a breath, and the air in the van turns a fraction denser, and my mouth closes without me telling it to. And I keep driving because that is the thing I know how to do. In case you're the kind who likes a piece of proof to turn over in your hand, I will admit that some nights I take the dog tag out and lay it flat on the counter and read the name in a light that makes the letters clearer, and I say that name, like it belongs to a man waiting for another man to say it. On 2 nights, the letters looked like one name, and on 2 others, they looked like something close. Once, for a breath, I thought I saw my own last name on that blackened oval, and I told myself it was one of the close names, and I put it away and did not turn the light off for a time after. When I went out in the morning, there were 4 dark prints on the dust of the van's driver's door that could have been the mark of gloved fingers. The prints were not in the right place for someone to open the door. They were where someone would put their hand to stand steady as they stepped up into a bed. Now and then still I catch them anywhere. US 90 runs straight enough that the horizon sits like a thin blade, and the day's heat has nowhere to go but up. You can learn the look of the yellow in those lights as if it were a color a person could own. You can tell yourself the story that makes you small and keeps you upright. You can make deals with yourself about windows and radios and the routes you'll take and won't. None of it matters when you're in the middle of the lane and the world folds neat at the overpass and unfolds again and leaves the smell in your cab, like a thought you didn't mean to think. When that happens, don't open your mouth and don't slow more than you have to, and don't try to count them. Count your breaths if you need to count anything. Put both hands on the wheel and keep between the painted lines. Tell yourself this is a straight road, and straight roads take you where you meant to go. You won't be wrong until you are. And if one day a chorus of engines with old iron throats finds you not on US 90 but in the small artery that leads to your own house, and slips under the low shadow of the overpass there as if that shadow had been waiting, just as well as all the others have, then you can come and stand in my kitchen, and I'll open the drawer and show you the tag. You can tell me what letters, you see. You can help me decide whether to keep breathing with my mouth closed while we wait for the sound to pass, or whether this time it's asking us to follow.